You were taught to eliminate anger, to suffocate it as if it were your enemy. But Buddhist monks have known for centuries that suppressing anger only makes it stronger, more toxic. When you stop fighting against it and learn to observe it with gentleness, something extraordinary happens. Anger reveals its message and then dissolves naturally. These 20 Buddhist methods will not force you to pretend peace. They will teach your mind to process anger like flowing water, without resistance and without internal violence. Your resentment is not weakness. It is wisdom not yet understood. Prepare to sleep while listening to this video. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment from which part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed how quickly anger can take over your entire being? One moment you're calm, and the next you're completely consumed by a powerful emotion that seems to hijack your thoughts and actions. The Buddhist approach to working with anger begins with something seemingly simple yet profoundly transformative: the practice of mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is one of the most fundamental practices in Buddhism for dealing with difficult emotions like anger. Rather than suppressing or indulging in anger, mindfulness teaches us to observe it with a kind of curious awareness. When we practice mindfulness, we learn to notice anger arising in our bodies and minds without immediately reacting to it. This creates a crucial space between the trigger and our response, a space where wisdom can emerge. The physical sensations of anger are often the first indicators that this emotion is arising. You might notice warmth spreading across your face, tightness in your chest, increased heart rate, or shallow breathing. By regularly practicing mindfulness meditation, you develop the capacity to recognize these early physical warning signs before anger fully takes control. This early recognition is invaluable because it gives you the opportunity to work skillfully with anger while it's still manageable rather than when it's already erupted. In traditional Buddhist teachings, anger is considered one of the 3 poisons of the mind, along with greed and delusion. The Buddha didn't suggest that we should never feel anger. He recognized it as a natural human emotion. However, he taught that by developing awareness of anger's presence, we could prevent it from leading to harmful actions. In the Anguttara Nikaya, he compared mindfulness to a gatekeeper who carefully monitors what enters and leaves a city, suggesting that with mindfulness, we can guard our minds against being overwhelmed by destructive emotions. When practicing mindfulness meditation to work with anger, the first step is establishing a foundation of awareness. This typically involves focusing attention on the natural rhythm of the breath, allowing the mind to settle. From this more stable foundation, we can then expand our awareness to include emotions as they arise. When anger appears, we acknowledge its presence without judgment. Anger is here now. This simple act of recognition already begins to transform our relationship with anger. Many people mistakenly believe that mindfulness meditation is about eliminating negative emotions or achieving a state of perpetual calm. This is a misunderstanding. The purpose of mindfulness is not to suppress anger, but to fully understand it. Through sustained observation, we begin to see the impermanent nature of anger, how it arises due to certain conditions, exists for a time, and eventually passes away on its own. We also start to recognize the thoughts that feed anger and keep it burning, as well as the underlying vulnerabilities or unmet needs that might be fueling it. There's a wonderful story about the Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh who taught that we should treat our anger like a crying baby. We wouldn't ignore a crying baby or punish it for crying. Instead, we would hold it tenderly and try to understand what it needs. Similarly, mindfulness invites us to cradle our anger with gentle awareness, asking, "What is this anger trying to tell me? What does it need?" This compassionate approach allows us to learn from anger rather than being controlled by it. The practice of mindfulness meditation gradually changes our relationship with anger in several important ways. First, we become less identified with anger. Instead of thinking, "I am angry," as if anger defines our entire being, we learn to see anger is present right now, recognizing it as a temporary state passing through awareness. This subtle shift in perspective creates freedom from anger's grip. Second, regular mindfulness practice helps us respond more skillfully when anger arises in daily life. Research has shown that mindfulness meditation actually changes brain structures associated with emotional regulation, particularly strengthening the prefrontal cortex while reducing reactivity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. These neurological changes translate into greater emotional resilience and a reduced tendency to fly into rage when provoked. Third, through mindfulness, we develop the ability to stay present with uncomfortable emotions rather than reacting habitually. Most people either suppress anger, which often leads to resentment and passive aggression, or express it impulsively, which can damage relationships. Mindfulness offers a middle path, acknowledging anger fully while choosing wise responses rather than harmful reactions. In practical terms, how does one practice mindfulness meditation for working with anger? You might begin with a daily sitting practice of 15 to 20 minutes, focusing on the breath and body sensations. When anger arises during formal meditation or is recalled from a recent situation, you direct gentle attention to how anger manifests in your body. Where do you feel it most strongly? What sensations accompany it? Heat, tension, pulsing. How does anger affect your breathing? You observe these physical manifestations with curiosity rather than aversion. Next, you might notice the thoughts associated with anger, stories about being wronged, judgments about others, desires for revenge. Without getting caught in these narratives, you simply note thinking and return to the sensations in the body. This practice interrupts the typical cycle where angry thoughts fuel angry feelings, which then generate more angry thoughts, creating a destructive spiral. The benefits of mindfulness for working with anger extend beyond formal meditation sessions. With regular practice, you'll find yourself naturally bringing awareness to anger as it emerges in daily life. You might notice irritation arising during a difficult conversation and take a conscious breath before responding. Or you might catch yourself ruminating about a past offense and gently redirect your attention to the present moment. This moment-to-moment mindfulness gradually becomes a natural way of relating to all experience, including challenging emotions. It's worth noting that mindfulness doesn't always immediately dissolve anger. Sometimes anger persists despite our awareness of it. The purpose of mindfulness isn't to make anger instantly disappear, but to prevent it from controlling our speech and actions. Even when anger remains present, mindfulness creates a container that holds it safely, preventing harmful expressions while allowing the emotion to naturally process and release. Over time, consistent mindfulness practice leads to profound insights about the nature of anger. We begin to see that behind anger often lies fear, hurt, or unmet needs. We recognize how our own attachments and expectations contribute to angry reactions. These insights naturally give rise to greater compassion, both for ourselves and for others who struggle with anger. This compassionate understanding becomes the foundation for genuine transformation, where anger can actually become a doorway to greater wisdom and connection rather than a force that divides. Metta Bhavana, the meditation of loving kindness. Imagine a mind completely free from ill will, resentment, and anger, a mind that naturally responds to difficulty with warmth and goodwill rather than hostility. This is not just an ideal, but a practical possibility through the cultivation of metta, often translated as loving kindness or benevolence. Metta Bhavana, the meditation practice that systematically develops this quality, stands as one of Buddhism's most powerful antidotes to anger and resentment. Metta is not simply positive thinking or forcing yourself to feel nice toward people who irritate you. It's a profound practice that gradually transforms your heart's natural response to challenging situations and difficult people. The Buddha taught metta as the direct opposite of anger, vyapada, explaining that, just as water naturally extinguishes fire, loving kindness naturally extinguishes ill will. When fully developed, metta leaves no room for anger to take root in the mind. The practice of metta bhavana follows a systematic progression that gradually expands our circle of goodwill. Traditionally, we begin by directing loving kindness toward ourselves, which might seem counterintuitive to Western minds accustomed to putting others first. However, the Buddha recognized that genuine goodwill toward others can only flow from a heart that's not harsh or critical toward itself. As he explained in the Samyutta Nikaya, searching all directions with one's awareness, one finds no one dearer than oneself. In the same way, others are dear to themselves, so one should not hurt others if one loves oneself. In formal metta practice, we begin by sitting in a comfortable meditation posture and bringing to mind our own qualities, kindnesses we've shown others, or simply our fundamental wish to be happy. We then silently repeat phrases that express wishes for our own well-being, such as, "May I be safe? May I be healthy? May I be happy? May I live with ease?" These aren't magical incantations, but tools to align our intention with the quality of loving kindness. As we repeat these phrases, we try to connect with the genuine feeling behind them, the authentic wish for our own well-being. Once we've established a sense of loving kindness toward ourselves, even if it's just a glimmer, we gradually expand the practice to include others. The traditional progression moves from a benefactor, someone who has helped us and is easy to appreciate, to a beloved friend, to a neutral person, someone we neither particularly like nor dislike, to a difficult person, and finally to all beings everywhere. With each person, we repeat the same well-wishing phrases, sincerely desiring their happiness and well-being. The most challenging and transformative stage involves directing metta toward difficult people, those with whom we have conflict or who have hurt us. This doesn't mean condoning harmful actions or becoming a doormat. Rather, it's recognizing the universal human wish to be happy beneath the unskillful behaviors. We might acknowledge, like me, this person wishes to be happy but is caught in their own confusion and pain. Even a moment of genuine well-wishing towards someone who has harmed us can begin to loosen the grip of resentment that ultimately harms us more than them. Metta practice directly counters our habitual ways of relating to anger, pshasham. When we're upset, we tend to ruminate on how wrong the other person is, mentally rehearsing arguments or plotting revenge. These thought patterns only strengthen anger's hold. Metta deliberately cultivates the opposite mental habit, wishing well instead of ill, seeing common humanity instead of an enemy. Over time, this rewires our default responses to provocation. Modern neuroscience has begun to validate what Buddhist practitioners have known for centuries, that metta practice literally changes the brain. Research conducted at Emory University and elsewhere has shown that regular loving-kindness meditation increases activation in brain areas associated with positive emotions and empathy while reducing activity in regions linked to negative emotions and self-focus. These neural changes translate into measurable increases in positive emotions, improved relationships, and greater resilience in the face of difficulties. The benefits of metta practice for transforming anger are numerous and profound. First, it directly counteracts the painful feeling of anger itself. While anger feels powerful in the moment, it actually creates significant suffering for the person experiencing it, raising blood pressure, disrupting sleep, and consuming mental energy. Metta generates feelings of warmth and openness that are inherently pleasant, providing an alternative emotional experience to anger's burning quality. Second, metta helps us recognize the shared humanity in those we're angry with. Anger typically involves dehumanizing the other person, seeing them as all bad or fundamentally different from us. Metta reminds us that beneath the behavior we dislike, there's a person who, like us, experiences joy and sorrow, hopes and fears. This recognition doesn't mean we approve of harmful actions, but it prevents us from demonizing the whole person because of specific behaviors. Third, regular metta practice builds a foundation of goodwill that makes us less likely to react with anger when provocative situations arise. It's like building up an immune system for the heart. We become naturally more resilient to irritation and offense. As the great Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah put it, "If you haven't wept deeply, you haven't begun to meditate." This speaks to how metta practice softens the heart, making it both stronger and more tender. While metta is often practiced as a formal seated meditation, its true power emerges when we bring it into daily life. For example, when stuck in traffic instead of fuming with impatience, we might silently wish well to the other drivers. May you reach your destination safely. When dealing with a difficult colleague, we might mentally note before a meeting, "Like me, this person wishes to be happy and free from suffering." These simple practices gradually reshape our habitual responses to potentially aggravating situations. Some practical tips can help deepen metta practice. Visualization often enhances the emotional connection, imagining the person you're sending good wishes to sitting before you, perhaps surrounded by a warm light. Physical sensations can serve as anchors for the feeling of loving kindness, noticing the warmth in the chest or a sense of openness that often accompanies genuine good wishes. And patience is essential. Metta grows gradually like a garden, not instantly like flipping a switch. It's worth noting that metta practice sometimes brings up its opposite. We might discover layers of anger, resentment or self-criticism we weren't fully aware of. This is actually a sign that the practice is working, bringing hidden emotional material into awareness where it can be processed and released. When this happens, we simply acknowledge these feelings without judgment before gently returning to the practice. The Buddha emphasized metta's importance by dedicating entire discourses to it, most famously the Metta Sutta, which describes the quality of mind a practitioner should cultivate. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. This boundless heart, embracing both those we love and those we struggle with, represents the fully developed potential of metta practice. Through consistent practice, metta gradually transforms our relationship with anger from the inside out. Rather than struggling to control or suppress angry feelings when they arise, we cultivate an alternative heart quality that naturally displaces anger. The mind filled with loving kindness finds less and less room for resentment and ill will. This isn't achieved through force or denial, but through patiently nurturing the seeds of goodwill until they naturally crowd out the weeds of anger. Through consistent practice of metta bhavana, we begin to dissolve the hardened barriers of resentment that separate us from others. This foundation of loving kindness naturally opens the door to another powerful Buddhist practice for transforming anger, the cultivation of compassion, or karuna. While metta focuses on wishing happiness for all beings, karuna responds specifically to suffering with a heartfelt wish to alleviate it. Karuna, or compassion, is particularly relevant when working with anger because it directly addresses how we respond to those who have caused us harm or pain. When someone hurts us, our natural reaction is often to harden our hearts against them, to view them as enemies deserving of our anger. Compassion offers a radically different approach, not by denying our pain, but by expanding our perspective to recognize the suffering in those who cause harm. The Buddha taught that people who act harmfully are themselves trapped in delusion and suffering. This understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but provides a more accurate perspective on its causes. Someone who lashes out in anger, speaks harshly, or intentionally causes pain is not acting from a place of inner well-being and clarity. Their actions reveal their own confusion, fear, an unresolved pain. One of the most striking teachings on compassion comes from a story about the Buddha himself. According to traditional accounts, his cousin Devadatta repeatedly tried to kill him, once by releasing a wild elephant to trample him, and another time by rolling a boulder down a hill toward him. The Buddha's response wasn't anger or desire for revenge, but compassion, recognizing that Devadatta's actions would bring himself far more suffering than they could ever cause the Buddha. This capacity to respond to harm with compassion rather than retaliation isn't about being weak or passive. In fact, it requires tremendous inner strength and clarity. It's easy to react to harm with more harm. That's the automatic, conditioned response. It takes courage and wisdom to break this cycle by responding with compassion instead. So how do we actually develop this quality of compassion for those who have harmed us? Buddhist tradition offers several specific practices. One approach begins with acknowledging our own pain fully, rather than bypassing our hurt feelings. We first need to recognize and honor them. Yes, this hurt. Yes, this matters. Genuine compassion can't be built on denial of our own experience. Once we've acknowledged our pain, we can begin to expand our awareness to consider the other person's experience. We might reflect. What kind of suffering would lead someone to act this way? What fears, pressures, or past traumas might be influencing their behavior? This isn't about making excuses, but about seeing the fuller picture of causes and conditions that contribute to harmful actions. A formal meditation practice for developing compassion involves visualizing the person who has harmed you and consciously reflecting on their essential humanity, their desire to be happy and free from suffering, just like you. You might silently repeat phrases such as, "Despite your harmful actions, like all beings, you too wish to be happy. May you be free from the inner suffering that causes you to harm others." Even a momentary glimpse of genuine compassion can begin to transform deep-seated anger. It's important to note that compassion doesn't mean allowing harmful behavior to continue. In fact, true compassion sometimes requires setting clear boundaries or even removing yourself from situations where harm is ongoing. The Buddha himself set clear boundaries with Devadatta, eventually expelling him from the monastic community while maintaining compassion for him. Compassion is about the quality of your heart, not about the specific actions you take in response to harm. One of the most powerful aspects of developing compassion for those who harm us is that it frees us from the prison of resentment. When we hold on to anger towards someone who has hurt us, we continue to suffer long after the initial harm occurred. As the saying goes, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Compassion liberates us from this self-inflicted suffering. Modern psychological research has begun to validate the healing power of compassion for those who've been harmed. Studies show that people who are able to cultivate some degree of compassion for those who've hurt them experience significantly better psychological and physical health outcomes than those who maintain resentment. This includes lower levels of anxiety and depression, better cardiovascular health, and stronger immune function. Developing compassion for those who harm us doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process that often includes setbacks and difficulties. You might find yourself alternating between glimpses of compassion and surges of renewed anger. This is perfectly normal. Buddhist practice is not about forcing yourself to feel compassionate when you don't. It's about patiently cultivating the conditions that allow compassion to emerge naturally over time. Sometimes people resist the idea of developing compassion for those who've harmed them because they fear it means forgetting or minimizing the wrong that was done. But compassion doesn't require forgetting or denying harm. In fact, it acknowledges the full reality of suffering, both yours and the other person's. Compassion recognizes that harmful actions cause suffering to both the victim and the perpetrator, though in different ways. Another common misunderstanding is that compassion means you need to have warm, fuzzy feelings towards someone who has hurt you. Compassion isn't necessarily a warm feeling. At its core, it's the sincere wish that suffering be alleviated. Sometimes compassion might feel more like a cool, clear recognition of shared humanity, despite strong disagreement with someone's actions. The practice of developing compassion for those who harm us connects directly with the Buddhist understanding of interdependence. We begin to see that people who cause harm are themselves caught in a web of causes and conditions, their own past experiences, societal influences, perhaps untreated trauma or mental health challenges, and fundamental confusion about what will bring true happiness. This broader perspective doesn't eliminate accountability, but adds a dimension of understanding that softens the grip of personal resentment. For particularly difficult cases where harm has been severe, compassion may need to develop in stages. You might begin by practicing compassion for yourself and the pain you've experienced, then perhaps extend compassion to others who have been harmed in similar ways. Only gradually might you begin to include the person who harmed you within the circle of your compassion, and only when you feel emotionally ready to do so. As compassion deepens, we often discover something surprising, that holding on to anger and resentment doesn't protect us as we thought it would. Instead, it keeps us locked in a painful relationship with the past, unable to fully live in the present moment. Compassion offers a path to freedom, not for the other person's sake alone, but for our own well-being and peace of mind. The development of karuna leads naturally to the fourth Buddhist quality that helps transform anger, upekkha, or equanimity. While compassion responds to suffering with the wish to alleviate it, equanimity provides the balanced, steady foundation that makes compassion sustainable rather than overwhelming. Equanimity is often misunderstood in Western contexts as indifference or not caring. Nothing could be further from its true meaning. Upekkha is not about emotional flatness or disconnection from life's experiences. Rather, it's about maintaining a balanced, steady mind regardless of whether circumstances are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It's the quality that allows us to remain centered and clear even when facing provocations that would normally trigger reactive anger. The Buddha described equanimity as an unshakable mind, one that isn't thrown off balance by the inevitable ups and downs of life. When someone criticizes us harshly, equanimity allows us to listen without immediately becoming defensive. When we face injustice, equanimity helps us respond with wise action rather than blind rage. When old resentments surface in the mind, equanimity enables us to see them clearly without being carried away by their emotional charge. Developing equanimity involves understanding several key insights from Buddhist psychology. First is recognizing that all experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, are impermanent. The praise we receive today may turn to criticism tomorrow. The person who angers us in the morning might help us in the afternoon. When we truly internalize the ever-changing nature of experience, we're less likely to overreact to any particular event. Second, equanimity is strengthened by understanding that, ultimately, we all experience the results of our own actions, karma. While we can and should work to create positive change in the world, we cannot control all outcomes or how others will behave. Recognizing the boundaries of our control helps us invest our energy wisely rather than burning ourselves out with futile anger over things we cannot change. Third, equanimity develops through seeing that getting what we want doesn't always bring happiness. And not getting what we want isn't necessarily a disaster. Our minds habitually create elaborate stories about how certain conditions will make us happy or miserable, but experience often proves otherwise. Equanimity arises as we learn to hold our preferences more lightly, without rigid attachment to specific outcomes. Practical techniques for developing equanimity often begin with meditation practices that help us observe our automatic reactions to pleasant and unpleasant experiences. We might intentionally bring to mind a minor irritation, perhaps a critical comment someone made, and notice our immediate reaction, the physical sensations, the emotional response, the thoughts that arise. Rather than suppressing these reactions or getting lost in them, we simply observe them with mindful awareness. With practice, we extend this observational capacity to increasingly challenging situations. We might reflect on a significant conflict or betrayal, observing how the mind generates stories of blame and resentment. Without forcing these reactions to change, we simply create space around them, recognizing. This is how anger feels in the body. This is how resentment thinks in the mind. This spacious awareness gradually diminishes the grip of reactive emotions. Another powerful practice involves deliberately contemplating the universal nature of certain challenging experiences. For instance, we might reflect, all people face criticism sometimes. All relationships include misunderstandings. All humans experience loss. This perspective helps us take life's difficulties less personally, recognizing them as part of our shared human experience rather than evidence that something is uniquely wrong with us or our lives. The development of equanimity doesn't mean we never feel anger or that we passively accept harmful situations. Rather, equanimity provides the stable foundation from which we can respond to difficulties with wisdom and compassion instead of reactivity. From equanimity, we might take very strong action to address injustice, but we'll do so from clarity rather than confusion, from commitment to positive change rather than hatred for those on the other side. Equanimity is particularly helpful when dealing with people who repeatedly trigger our anger. We all have certain individuals who seem to know exactly how to push our buttons, perhaps a family member who makes the same hurtful comment at every gathering, or a co-worker whose habits drive us crazy. Rather than being caught off guard each time, equanimity allows us to anticipate these triggers and prepare a wiser response. One traditional Buddhist metaphor compares the equanimous mind to the vast sky. Emotions like anger, fear, or attachment are like clouds passing through this sky. No matter how dark or stormy the clouds, the sky itself remains unchanged, spacious enough to contain any weather without being damaged by it. With practice, we begin to identify more with the awareness that observes emotions, the sky, than with the temporary emotional states themselves, the clouds. In daily life, equanimity manifests as a growing capacity to pause before reacting when provoked. This pause might be as brief as a single breath or as extended as removing yourself from a situation to reflect more deeply. Either way, it creates the crucial space in which wisdom can operate. Instead of speaking or acting from automatic anger, we can choose responses aligned with our deeper values. Perhaps most importantly, equanimity helps us maintain perspective during conflicts. When anger arises, it tends to narrow our focus dramatically. The person or situation that angered us seems all-important, and our angry thoughts feel completely justified. Equanimity broadens this narrow focus, reminding us that this particular conflict is just one small part of a much larger life context. This wider perspective naturally reduces the intensity of anger. The development of equanimity doesn't happen overnight. Like all Buddhist practices, it's cultivated gradually through consistent effort over time. There will be situations where equanimity eludes us, where we get caught in reactivity despite our best intentions. These moments aren't failures, but opportunities to learn more about our triggers and patterns, strengthening our practice for the future. As equanimity deepens, we discover an inner stability that doesn't depend on external circumstances. We can face criticism without crumbling, encounter opposition without hatred, and navigate conflicts without losing our center. This stability doesn't isolate us from life's challenges. Instead, it allows us to engage with them more fully and effectively, free from the distortions of reactive anger. The inner stability that equanimity provides creates the perfect foundation for another profound Buddhist insight that helps transform anger: the understanding of impermanence, or anicca. While equanimity helps us remain balanced during emotional storms, the recognition of impermanence helps us see that even the most intense anger is a temporary state that will naturally pass away. Anicca, the Pali word for impermanence, is considered one of the three fundamental characteristics of existence in Buddhist philosophy, alongside suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. The Buddha emphasized that everything in our experience, from physical objects to emotional states, from relationships to belief systems, is in constant flux, continuously arising and passing away. When it comes to working with anger, the understanding of impermanence is incredibly liberating. Most of us tend to experience anger as a solid, enduring state, I am angry, as though the anger has taken over our entire identity. We believe that once anger arises, it will stay until either we express it or suppress it. But careful observation reveals a different reality. Anger, like all emotional states, is constantly changing in its quality and intensity. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This insight isn't just philosophical theory, it's something we can verify through direct observation. Next time you notice anger arising, try watching it closely without judgment. You'll likely observe that what we call anger isn't a single, solid thing, but a complex flow of changing sensations, thoughts, and energies. There might be heat in the face, tightness in the chest, racing thoughts, each aspect subtly shifting moment by moment. The Buddha taught his followers to observe impermanence in everything, including their own emotional states. In the Satipatthana Sutta, a key discourse on mindfulness practice, he instructs practitioners to observe how mental states arise, how they remain present for a time, and how they eventually pass away. This careful observation gradually undermines our tendency to identify with passing emotional states as though they define who we are. A helpful way to work with anger through the lens of impermanence is to change the language we use internally. Instead of thinking, I am angry, which implies a solid, enduring state that defines us, we can note anger is present right now, or anger is arising in this moment. This slight shift in language acknowledges the temporary, visiting nature of the emotion rather than treating it as an identity. The understanding of impermanence also helps us relate differently to the situations that trigger our anger. Often we react with anger because we perceive a situation as permanent or defining. This always happens. They never listen. This ruins everything. When we recognize the impermanent nature of all situations, we can hold them more lightly. A conflict that seems devastating today may be resolved tomorrow. A person who seems unchangeably difficult may surprise us with growth and change over time. There's a powerful story from Buddhist tradition about a monk who was struggling with anger toward another monk in his community. He went to the Buddha seeking advice, explaining all the reasons why his anger was justified. The Buddha listened patiently and then asked him a simple question. This anger that you're holding, is it permanent or impermanent? The monk, knowing the Buddha's teachings well, had to admit that the anger was impermanent. The Buddha then asked, if it's impermanent, is it worth clinging to as though it were a solid truth? This simple questioning helped the monk see his anger in a new light, not as justified truth, but as a passing state that would eventually dissolve. Contemplating impermanence doesn't mean we become passive about injustice or harm. We can take appropriate action to address problems while simultaneously recognizing the changing nature of all situations. In fact, understanding impermanence can make our actions more effective because we're not rigidly attached to our anger or to fixed views about others. One practical approach to working with anger through the lens of impermanence is to recall times when you were intensely angry, but the anger eventually passed. Perhaps you had a major conflict with someone you love, and at the time, the anger felt all-consuming. Yet days, months, or years later, that anger subsided. This reflection helps us trust that even current anger, no matter how intense it feels, will eventually transform. Another helpful practice is to observe the impermanence of anger in real time. When you notice anger arising, you might set a timer for 5 minutes and closely observe how the emotion changes during that time. Even within such a short period, you'll likely notice subtle shifts in intensity, physical sensations, and associated thoughts. This direct observation gradually undermines our perception of anger as a solid, unchanging state. Understanding the impermanent nature of anger doesn't mean we try to rush its passing. Paradoxically, fully accepting anger's presence in the moment while simultaneously recognizing its impermanence can actually help it transform more naturally. It's like holding a handful of sand. Grip it tightly and it gets stuck. Hold it openly and it can flow through your fingers. Even the triggers for our anger change over time. Things that made us furious in our 20s might seem trivial in our 50s. Insults that once would have provoked rage might later elicit only mild annoyance or even compassion for the person delivering them. This changing relationship with potential anger triggers illustrates how our responses aren't fixed but continue to evolve throughout our lives. The Buddha compared our tendency to hold on to anger with a person who has been shot with an arrow, then takes a second arrow and shoots themselves again. The first arrow represents the initial pain or difficulty we encounter. The second arrow represents our reaction of anger, which creates additional suffering. Understanding impermanence helps us avoid that second arrow by recognizing that both the initial situation and our emotional reaction to it will naturally change over time. As our experiential understanding of impermanence deepens, we become less inclined to build elaborate stories around moments of anger. Rather than constructing narratives about how we've been wronged or how others should behave differently, we simply observe the changing flow of experience. This doesn't mean we become passive or fail to address problems. Rather, we address them from a place of clear seeing rather than reactive anger. While the insight into impermanence helps us see anger as a passing state rather than a fixed identity, the Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen offers a powerful method for actively transforming anger and resentment into compassion. Tonglen, which means giving and taking or sending and receiving, is a meditation practice that directly challenges our habitual tendency to avoid suffering and cling to pleasure. In conventional thinking, we try to push away negative emotions like anger and hold on to positive states. Tonglen practice deliberately reverses this pattern. During Tonglen meditation, we visualize breathing in the suffering, pain, and negativity of ourselves and others, and breathing out relief, healing, and positivity. Rather than avoiding difficult emotions, we move toward them with courage and compassion. The basic structure of Tonglen practice is remarkably straightforward. Sitting in meditation posture, you begin by resting briefly in open awareness. Then, as you breathe in, you visualize taking in suffering in the form of dark, hot, heavy smoke or pollution. As you breathe out, you visualize sending out relief, happiness, and healing in the form of cool, bright light. This reversal of our usual pattern, breathing in what we normally avoid and breathing out what we normally cling to, gradually transforms our relationship with difficult emotions like anger. When working specifically with anger through Tonglen, you might begin with your own experience of anger. As you breathe in, visualize drawing in all your feelings of anger, resentment, and rage as dark smoke. Don't shy away from these feelings, but breathe them in fully. As you breathe out, visualize releasing cooling relief, understanding, and clarity. After working with your own anger for a while, you can expand to include others who are caught in similar anger and resentment. One of the most powerful applications of Tonglen is practicing it for people you're angry with. When someone has hurt or offended you, the normal reaction is to harden against them and wish for them to experience negative consequences. In Tonglen, you do the opposite. You breathe in their confusion, pain, and negativity, which likely contributed to their harmful behavior, and breathe out wishes for their well-being and clarity. This doesn't mean you approve of harmful actions. Rather, you're recognizing that negative behaviors come from suffering and confusion. Pema Chodron, a well-known Western teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, describes Tonglen as a method for connecting with suffering, ours and that which is all around us, everywhere we go. It is a method for overcoming fear of suffering and for dissolving the tightness of our heart. When we're caught in anger, our heart becomes tight and closed. Tonglen practice gradually softens this tightness, allowing our natural compassion to flow more freely. The practice of Tonglen directly counters one of the main forces that sustains anger, the separation between self and other. When we're angry, we typically create a solid boundary between ourselves, who we see as right or justified, and the other person, who we see as wrong or bad. Tonglen begins to dissolve this boundary by recognizing that all beings experience similar emotions and all wish to be free from suffering. The practice helps us see our fundamental connectedness rather than emphasizing our differences. Tonglen also addresses the self-centeredness that often fuels anger. When we're caught in anger, we're typically very focused on our own perspective, our own hurt, our own rightness. The practice of taking in others' suffering and sending out relief naturally shifts our focus from narrow self-concern to broader compassion. This wider perspective makes it difficult to maintain rigid anger. Many people initially find Tonglen counterintuitive or even frightening. There's a common fear that if we breathe in suffering or negativity, we'll become overwhelmed by it. However, practitioners consistently report the opposite experience, that Tonglen creates a sense of strength, openness, and connectedness. By moving toward difficult emotions rather than away from them, we discover they have less power over us than we feared. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition likens anger to a forest fire that burns everything in its path, including, eventually, the person who holds it. Tonglen practice is like creating a clear space around that fire, preventing it from consuming us while also sending cooling relief to all who are affected by it. Over time, the practice transforms our relationship with anger from one of being consumed by it to one of working with it skillfully. Tonglen can be practiced formally during meditation sessions, but it can also be applied informally throughout daily life. When you notice anger arising during a difficult interaction, you can take a few moments to breathe in the difficult energy of the situation and breathe out clarity and spaciousness. This doesn't require closing your eyes or sitting in meditation posture. It can be done in the midst of any situation where anger arises. For those struggling with deep-seated resentment or rage from past traumas, Tonglen should be approached gradually and often with the guidance of an experienced teacher or therapist. You might begin by practicing for yourself or for people with whom you have milder conflicts before attempting to practice for those associated with severe trauma or harm. The practice should feel challenging but not overwhelming. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, is known to practice Tonglen regularly, including for the Chinese officials responsible for the occupation of Tibet and the suffering of the Tibetan people. This doesn't mean he approves of their actions or fails to work for justice. Rather, he recognizes that responding with hatred would only create more suffering for everyone involved, including himself. This example demonstrates how Tonglen can support both internal emotional transformation and effective action in the world. The beauty of Tonglen is that it provides a direct method for transforming anger in the moment it arises, rather than suppressing anger or expressing it harmfully. We have a third option: to use the energy of anger as the very material for developing compassion and clarity. This alchemical transformation turns what could be poison into medicine, benefiting both ourselves and others caught in similar struggles with anger and resentment. The transformative practice of Tonglen opens us to a deeper understanding of one of Buddhism's most profound and liberating insights: anatta, or the doctrine of non-self. This teaching directly addresses the root cause of our persistent anger and resentment by questioning the very notion of a solid, separate self that can be offended or harmed in the first place. Anatta, often translated as non-self or selflessness, is considered one of Buddhism's most distinctive and challenging teachings. It doesn't claim that we don't exist at all, but rather that we don't exist in the way we habitually believe, as separate, permanent, independent selves. The Buddha taught that what we call self is actually a dynamic process rather than a fixed entity, a flowing collection of physical sensations, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and consciousness that is constantly changing. When it comes to anger, period, this insight is revolutionary. Think about what happens when you become angry. Usually there's a strong sense of I who has been wronged, insulted, or threatened. I was disrespected. My ideas were ignored. Someone cut me off in traffic. The emotion of anger strengthens this sense of a separate self that needs to be defended against others who are perceived as truly separate from me. The doctrine of non-self invites us to look more closely at this experience. When we're caught in anger, we can pause and investigate. What exactly is this I that feels so offended? Is it my body, my thoughts, my social role or reputation? When we look carefully, we find that none of these elements is permanent or independent. The body is constantly changing. Thoughts arise and pass away continuously, and even our most cherished identities shift over time. A traditional Buddhist analogy compares the self to a chariot. If you take apart a chariot, removing the wheels, axle, carriage, pole, and so on, at what point does it stop being a chariot? The word chariot is just a convenient label for a temporary collection of parts functioning together. Similarly, self is a useful conventional label, but when we search for an unchanging, independent entity behind the label, we can't find one. How does this understanding help with anger? When we deeply recognize that there is no solid, permanent self to be offended or threatened, the grip of personal anger naturally begins to loosen. If there's no permanent me against which an offense was committed, who exactly is holding the grudge? If both myself and the person who wronged me are constantly changing processes rather than fixed entities, what exactly am I holding on to? This doesn't mean we become passive doormats who allow harmful behavior to continue. Quite the opposite. Action taken from the understanding of non-self is typically more effective because it's not clouded by personal reactivity. We can address problems and establish boundaries without the heavy burden of personal resentment. The Buddha taught this principle in the Kakachupama Sutta, where he advises, even if bandits were to sever you savagely limb by limb with a two-handled saw, anyone who gave rise to a mind of hate would not be carrying out my teaching. This striking statement doesn't ask us to approve of harm, but to recognize that responding with hatred creates additional suffering without resolving the original problem. Practicing with the insight of non-self begins with simple observation of our experience when anger arises. We can notice how quickly the mind creates a solid story about me and them, how it solidifies fluid situations into fixed narratives about who's right and who's wrong. Just recognizing this pattern is the beginning of freedom from it. We can then investigate anger more deeply using questions that illuminate the emptiness of self. Who exactly is angry right now? Where precisely is this anger located? Who is it that feels offended? These aren't abstract philosophical questions, but practical tools for loosening anger's grip in the moment it arises. Many people misunderstand the teaching of non-self, fearing it means they will lose something essential or become somehow less real. But practitioners consistently report the opposite experience, a sense of lightness, freedom, and connection when the burden of maintaining a separate, defended self is relaxed, rather than diminishing our humanity. The insight into non-self often allows us to participate more fully and authentically in life. The doctrine of non-self also helps us understand why certain situations trigger such intense anger. Often, the strongest anger arises when our sense of identity is threatened, when someone criticizes a group we identify with, challenges beliefs central to our self-image, or threatens our status. Recognizing how we construct and defend these identities helps us hold them more lightly, making us less vulnerable to reactive anger when they're challenged. Non-self is not just an abstract concept, but a direct insight that can be experienced through meditation practice. As we consistently observe the changing nature of body sensations, emotions, and thoughts, we begin to see firsthand that there is no unchanging controller behind these experiences. They arise due to causes and conditions, persist for a time, and then pass away, all without a central self directing the process. Over time, this insight fundamentally transforms our experience of anger and resentment, rather than solid, justified emotions that define us. They're recognized as temporary energetic patterns moving through awareness. This doesn't mean the emotions disappear instantly, but their power to control our speech and actions gradually diminishes. There's a wonderful story about the Thai meditation master Ajahn Chah that illustrates the freedom that comes from understanding non-self. A visitor once complained to him about some monk's behavior, becoming increasingly agitated as he spoke. Ajahn Chah listened calmly and then asked, "Is that anger you're feeling bothering you?" The visitor was taken aback, suddenly recognizing that he was the one suffering from his own anger. In that moment of seeing anger as just a passing experience rather than who I am, freedom became possible. The insights of non-self extend beyond our individual experience to how we view others who have harmed or offended us. Just as we are not fixed, unchanging entities, neither are they. The person who acted harmfully last year, last month, or even yesterday is not exactly the same person who exists today. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does challenge our tendency to permanently label and dismiss entire human beings based on specific actions. This understanding of non-self naturally leads us to more skillful communication with others, especially in challenging situations where anger might typically arise. This brings us to another powerful Buddhist approach to transforming anger: the practice of mindful communication based on the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha's Eightfold Path includes specific guidance for how we can communicate in ways that reduce harm and promote understanding rather than escalating conflicts. Right speech, samavaka, and right action, samakamanta, provide practical guidelines for interaction that can transform potentially angry exchanges into opportunities for greater connection. Right speech, as taught by the Buddha, has four main aspects: abstaining from false speech, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle chatter. In practical terms, this means speaking truthfully, in ways that promote harmony rather than division, with kindness rather than harshness, and with purpose rather than mindless gossip. These guidelines sound simple, but applying them consistently, especially in heated moments, requires considerable mindfulness and practice. The first aspect, truthfulness, is fundamental. When we're angry, we often exaggerate, make sweeping generalizations, or selectively remember facts that support our position. Mindful communication begins with a commitment to factual accuracy, even when emotions run high. This doesn't mean expressing every thought that crosses our mind. Sometimes restraint is the more truthful choice, but ensuring that what we do say reflects reality as accurately as possible. The second aspect, avoiding divisive speech, is particularly relevant in conflicts. Anger often drives us to create stark divisions between us and them, seeking allies who will take our side against the perceived wrongdoer. Mindful communication resists this divisive tendency, looking instead for common ground and shared humanity, even with those who have upset us. The third aspect, avoiding harsh speech, directly addresses how anger typically expresses itself. When we're angry, our tone often becomes cutting, sarcastic, or contemptuous. Words become weapons designed to hurt rather than tools for understanding. Mindful communication involves monitoring not just the content of our speech, but its tone and emotional quality. Even difficult truths can be expressed with basic respect for the dignity of the listener. The fourth aspect, avoiding idle chatter, reminds us to be purposeful in our communication. When we're caught in anger, we often ruminate and repeatedly retell the story of how we've been wronged, keeping the emotional wound fresh. Mindful communication means speaking with clear intention rather than simply venting or reinforcing grievances. Beyond these guidelines for what to avoid, the Buddha also offered positive guidance for how to communicate, especially in difficult situations. He advised speaking at the right time, based in fact, spoken gently, beneficial, and with a mind of goodwill. These positive qualities provide a helpful checklist for evaluating our communication when conflicts arise. Practical techniques for mindful communication often begin with pausing before responding when we feel anger arising. This pause might be as brief as a single conscious breath, or as extended as excusing yourself from a heated situation until you can respond more skillfully. Either way, this intentional space interrupts the automatic anger response and creates room for choice. During this pause, we can check in with our bodies, noticing physical signs of anger such as increased heart rate, muscle tension, or shallow breathing. Simply recognizing these sensations helps prevent them from automatically driving reactive speech. We can take a few deeper breaths, perhaps silently repeating a calming phrase like, "May I respond with wisdom," before continuing the conversation. Another powerful technique is to listen more deeply when conflicts arise. Often when someone says something that triggers our anger, we immediately stop listening and start formulating our defense or counterattack. Mindful communication involves maintaining genuine curiosity about the other person's perspective. Even when we strongly disagree, this doesn't mean we abandon our own viewpoint, but that we create space to truly hear the other before responding. The practice of reflective listening can be particularly helpful in heated exchanges. This involves briefly summarizing what you've heard the other person say before responding with your own thoughts. "So what I'm hearing is that you felt dismissed when I interrupted the meeting. Is that right?" This simple practice often prevents misunderstandings that fuel unnecessary anger. When expressing our own feelings in difficult conversations, Buddhist-inspired approaches like nonviolent communication suggest using I statements rather than accusatory you statements. Instead of "you're so inconsiderate," we might say, "I felt hurt when the plans were changed without checking with me first." This shift reduces defensiveness in the listener while still honestly expressing our experience. Mindful communication also involves recognizing when a conversation is becoming unproductive and needs to pause or shift course. Signs that this might be necessary include escalating emotional intensity, repetitive arguments, or physical symptoms of extreme stress. Taking a mutual break with an agreement to resume when calmer can prevent damaging words that might otherwise take months to repair. The Buddha emphasized that speech should be motivated by goodwill rather than ill will. Before speaking, especially in conflict situations, we can briefly check our intention. Are we speaking to create understanding, resolve a problem, or establish necessary boundaries? Or are we speaking to hurt, punish, or win against the other person? This simple check can dramatically shift the quality of our communication. Many people find it helpful to practice mindful communication in less charged situations before attempting to apply it in their most difficult relationships. You might practice with a supportive friend, being especially attentive to speaking truthfully, harmoniously, kindly, and purposefully. This builds the muscle of mindful speech that can later be applied in more challenging contexts. Research in communication psychology strongly supports the effectiveness of these Buddhist-inspired approaches. Studies show that pausing before responding, listening fully before speaking, using I statements rather than accusations, and maintaining a respectful tone even during disagreements significantly reduces conflict escalation and improves relationship outcomes. The practice of mindful communication doesn't mean we never express disagreement or set boundaries. Sometimes the kindest, most truthful communication requires saying difficult things. The difference is that mindful communication delivers these messages with basic respect for the other's dignity and without the destructive energy of hostile anger. Over time, consistent practice of mindful communication creates new habits that gradually replace our reactive patterns. We become less easily triggered into defensive anger during conversations. We find ourselves naturally pausing before responding in difficult situations. We discover that we can be honest and direct without being harsh or divisive. These changes not only reduce our own suffering from anger, but contribute to more harmonious relationships with everyone we encounter. The practice of mindful communication naturally leads us to one of Buddhism's most powerful methods for working with anger and resentment: the practice of forgiveness. In Buddhist understanding, forgiveness isn't something we do for others. It's a process of freeing our own hearts from the burden of resentment, regardless of whether reconciliation with the other person is possible or appropriate. Buddhist forgiveness differs significantly from how forgiveness is often understood in Western contexts. It doesn't mean saying that harmful actions were acceptable or that the person who caused harm shouldn't face consequences. It doesn't require reconciliation or maintaining a relationship with someone who has acted harmfully. Rather, Buddhist forgiveness is primarily an internal process of releasing the grip that resentment has on our own hearts and minds. There's a saying often attributed to Buddhist teacher Jack Cornfield: "Forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past." This captures the essence of Buddhist forgiveness, recognizing that the past cannot be changed, but our relationship to it can be transformed through the practice of letting go. As long as we remain caught in resentment about past hurts, we keep ourselves tethered to that suffering, repeatedly reliving the pain in our minds. The Buddha spoke about the burdensome nature of holding on to anger in the Dhammapada, comparing it to picking up a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This imagery vividly illustrates how harboring resentment primarily harms ourselves, consuming our mental energy and contaminating our present experience long after the original incident has passed. Buddhist forgiveness practice begins with acknowledging the full reality of what happened and the genuine hurt it caused. This is crucial. Forgiveness doesn't mean minimizing harm or pretending you weren't affected. In fact, attempting to forgive prematurely, before fully acknowledging your pain, often leads to what psychologists call false forgiveness, which doesn't truly heal the wound. Once we've honestly acknowledged the hurt, Buddhist practice invites us to investigate our resentment with mindful awareness. We notice where resentment lives in the body, perhaps as tightness in the chest or shoulders, a knot in the stomach, or tension in the jaw. We observe the thoughts that accompany resentment, often repetitive stories about how we were wronged, what should have happened instead, or fantasies of retribution. Without judging these sensations and thoughts, we simply become aware of how resentment manifests in our direct experience. This honest observation often reveals something important. While the original harm may have happened once, our resentment makes us relive it hundreds or thousands of times in our minds. Each time we mentally replay the story of how we were wronged, we re-experience the emotional pain, keeping the wound fresh. This recognition that we're now causing our own suffering through resentment can be a powerful motivator for the forgiveness process. Formal Buddhist forgiveness practices often involve specific contemplations and guided meditations. One traditional approach begins with extending forgiveness toward yourself. This acknowledges that holding on to resentment harms you first and foremost. You might silently repeat phrases like, "I forgive myself for holding on to this pain for so long. I forgive myself for all the ways I've kept this resentment alive. I now choose to begin releasing this burden for my own well-being." The practice then gradually expands to include the person who caused harm. This doesn't happen all at once, but in stages as you become ready. You might begin by simply acknowledging their fundamental humanity, that like all beings, they too experience joy and sorrow, success and failure, clarity and confusion. You might reflect on the complex web of causes and conditions that influence their harmful behavior, their own past experiences, possible trauma, limited understanding, or mental afflictions that clouded their judgment. These reflections aren't meant to excuse harmful behavior, but to see it in a broader context that makes forgiveness possible. When we recognize that people cause harm because of their own suffering and confusion, not because they're inherently evil, it becomes easier to release the personal resentment while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Many people struggle with forgiveness because they mistakenly believe it means they need to feel warmly towards someone who hurt them. Buddhist forgiveness doesn't require positive feelings toward the person. It's not about manufacturing affection or trust where none exists. Rather, it's about releasing the grip of resentment that keeps us bound to our pain. Success in forgiveness isn't measured by warm feelings, but by the growing sense of inner freedom as resentment's weight is lifted. Another common misunderstanding is that forgiveness means allowing harmful behavior to continue. In fact, forgiveness and maintaining clear boundaries can and often should go together. You can internally forgive someone while still choosing not to have them in your life, or while establishing clear consequences for their actions. Buddhist teacher Thanissaro Bhikkhu points out that forgiveness doesn't mean you have to continue associating with everyone who has harmed you. Sometimes the wisest choice is to forgive internally while maintaining distance externally. The process of forgiveness rarely happens all at once. For minor offenses, we might achieve forgiveness relatively quickly, but for deep wounds or significant trauma, forgiveness typically unfolds as a gradual process with many layers. You might find yourself cycling through stages of anger, grief, understanding, and release many times before forgiveness feels complete. This is normal and should be approached with patience and self-compassion. Research in psychology strongly supports the benefits of forgiveness for mental and physical health. Studies have linked forgiveness with lower levels of anxiety, depression, and stress, improved cardiovascular health, better immune function, and stronger relationship satisfaction. These findings align with what Buddhist practitioners have known for centuries, that forgiveness liberates us from the corrosive effects of resentment, creating space for genuine well-being. For particularly challenging situations where forgiveness seems impossible, Buddhist practice suggests beginning with the intention to forgive, even if the feelings aren't yet there. You might acknowledge, "Right now, full forgiveness feels beyond my capacity, but I'm setting the intention to move in that direction for my own well-being." This honest intention, held gently without self-judgment, creates the conditions for forgiveness to gradually develop. Some traditions also recommend practicing forgiveness toward yourself for your own harmful actions before attempting to forgive others for theirs. This creates a foundation of self-compassion that supports the challenging work of forgiving those who have hurt you. Self-forgiveness isn't about avoiding responsibility for your actions, but about releasing unproductive shame and self-punishment that prevent genuine change and growth. The deep work of Buddhist forgiveness naturally leads us to another powerful practice for transforming anger, Vipassana meditation, which develops insight into the true nature of our experience, including difficult emotions like anger. While forgiveness helps us release past resentments, Vipassana helps us work skillfully with anger as it arises in the present moment by investigating its actual nature. Vipassana, which means clear seeing, or insight in Pali, is one of Buddhism's most ancient and transformative meditation practices. Unlike concentration practices that focus the mind on a single object, Vipassana develops a more panoramic awareness that observes all aspects of our experience, physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, and consciousness itself, with clear, non-judgmental attention. Through this detailed observation, we gain direct insight into the three characteristics that the Buddha identified as fundamental to all experience: impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. When it comes to working with anger, Vipassana provides a method for investigating its true nature rather than either suppressing it or being consumed by it. Instead of simply identifying as an angry person or trying to push anger away, Vipassana teaches us to break down the experience of anger into its component parts and observe each aspect with precision and curiosity. The practice begins with establishing a foundation of concentration and mindfulness, typically by focusing attention on the breath or body sensations. Once the mind has settled to some degree, we expand our awareness to include whatever is most prominent in our experience. When anger arises, rather than getting caught in its story or trying to make it go away, we turn our attention directly toward the anger itself. Through Vipassana practice, we learn to recognize the physical components of anger, perhaps heat in the face, tightness in the chest, accelerated heart rate, or clenched muscles. We notice how these sensations aren't static but constantly changing in intensity and quality. We observe the thoughts that accompany anger, judgments, blame, fantasies of confrontation or revenge, seeing how they arise and pass away. We become aware of the emotional feeling tone of anger, the burning, agitated quality that colors our experience. This detailed observation reveals something profound. What we call anger isn't a solid, unified thing, but a complex process made up of many changing elements. There's no single entity called anger that invades us from outside or arises from some fixed angry core within us. Instead, there's a flowing collection of sensations, thoughts, and emotional tones that we've labeled anger for convenience. The Buddha compared this process of investigation to a skilled butcher who knows exactly how to carve an animal at the joints, separating it into its component parts rather than hacking away randomly. Similarly, Vipassana helps us carve our experience of anger at its natural joints, seeing the distinct elements that make it up rather than relating to it as a solid block. Through this practice, we begin to experience directly the three characteristics of existence that the Buddha emphasized. We see the impermanence of anger, how it isn't a fixed state but a constantly changing flow of sensations and thoughts that arise and pass away. We notice its unsatisfactory nature, how being caught in anger creates tension and suffering even beyond the original trigger. And we recognize the absence of a separate self that owns the anger or against whom it is directed, seeing instead an impersonal process of causes and conditions unfolding. This insight doesn't make anger instantly disappear, but it fundamentally changes our relationship with it. Instead of being completely identified with anger, I am angry, we recognize anger as a temporary phenomenon moving through awareness. Anger is present right now. This subtle shift creates a crucial space between ourselves and the emotion, not to disconnect from it, but to relate to it more wisely. A traditional Vipassana instruction for working with anger involves breaking down our experience into increasingly finer slices of time, rather than perceiving anger as a solid block that lasts for minutes or hours. We observe individual moments of experience, this sensation, this thought, this impulse, each arising and passing away. This microscopic attention reveals the space between moments of anger, showing that it's not as solid or continuous as it first appears. The practice also helps us recognize the difference between primary and secondary aspects of anger. Primary anger might be a simple response to a situation, while secondary aspects involve all the additional layers we add through judgment, storytelling, and identification For example, we might feel a flash of anger when someone cuts us off in traffic, primary, but then add layers of judgment. What a terrible driver. Storytelling. People are so selfish these days. And self-identification. I always get disrespected like this. Vipassana helps us see these additional layers clearly, giving us the choice to let them go even if the initial anger response has already arisen. Practicing Vipassana with anger doesn't mean forcing ourselves to feel peaceful or suppressing the anger. In fact, such attempts at control often backfire, creating additional tension and self-judgment. Instead, Vipassana involves a radical acceptance of whatever is present, including difficult emotions. This acceptance isn't resignation or approval, but a clear seeing of what's actually happening in this moment as the necessary foundation for wise response. Joseph Goldstein, period, a prominent Western Vipassana teacher, describes how this approach transforms our relationship with anger. We're not trying to get rid of anger. We're trying to understand its nature. And when we understand its nature, its impermanence, its insubstantiality, our relationship to it changes. We're no longer so caught by it. For those new to Vipassana, working with intense anger might not be the best place to start. It's often helpful to begin practicing with more neutral or mildly pleasant experiences, developing the skills of mindful observation before turning toward challenging emotions. Alternatively, you might begin by observing milder forms of irritation or frustration before working with full-blown rage. The insights gained through Vipassana meditation don't just help us during formal practice. They gradually transform how we experience anger in daily life. We become more able to catch anger in its early stages, before it fully takes over. We develop the ability to recognize its components without being swept away by its story. We learn to respond with wisdom rather than react automatically when triggers arise. Vipassana practice reveals that anger, like all emotional states, has no inherent power to control us. Its apparent power comes from our identification with it and belief in the stories it tells. As we continue to investigate anger with clear awareness, we gradually untangle ourselves from its grip, finding freedom not by eliminating anger, but by relating to it with wisdom and equanimity. This doesn't mean we become emotionally flat or unable to respond to injustice. In fact, the energy that previously fueled reactive anger can be transformed into wise, compassionate action that addresses problems more effectively. Many social activists have found that Vipassana practice helps them channel their passion for justice in ways that create real change without the burnout that often comes from anger-driven activism. The practice of Vipassana meditation gives us direct insight into the nature of anger as it arises in the present moment. This insight naturally connects to another profound Buddhist teaching that helps transform our relationship with anger: the doctrine of karma. Often misunderstood in Western contexts as some form of cosmic justice or punishment, karma actually refers to the natural law of cause and effect that operates in our actions and their consequences. The word karma literally means action in Sanskrit, and it encompasses both our intentional actions and their results. The Buddha taught that every volitional action, whether of body, speech, or mind, leaves an imprint that will eventually bear fruit in our experience. Actions motivated by anger, hatred, and revenge create seeds that will ripen into future suffering, while actions rooted in compassion, wisdom, and restraint lead to more positive outcomes. When we're caught in anger, we often feel justified in lashing out or seeking revenge. We believe that retaliating against someone who has harmed us will bring satisfaction or closure. The teaching of karma helps us see beyond this immediate impulse by revealing the longer-term consequences of acting from anger. As the Buddha succinctly put it in the Dhammapada, hatred never ceases by hatred. By non-hatred alone does hatred cease. This is an eternal law. This statement points to a profound truth that most of us have experienced firsthand. Responding to anger with more anger only perpetuates and escalates conflict. Someone insults us. We respond with a cutting remark. They escalate further. And soon a minor disagreement has spiraled into a major confrontation. Each retaliatory action creates momentum that keeps the cycle going, sometimes extending conflicts across years or even generations. Understanding karma gives us the motivation and perspective to break this cycle. We recognize that regardless of how justified our anger feels in the moment, actions taken from that anger will create causes for future suffering, primarily our own. This doesn't mean we should passively accept harmful behavior or fail to establish appropriate boundaries. Rather, it means we find ways to address problems and protect ourselves that don't create additional seeds of suffering through hatred and retaliation. Consider how this might work in a practical situation. Imagine a colleague takes credit for your idea during a meeting. The immediate impulse might be anger, followed by thoughts of how to get even or publicly expose them. Understanding karma would help you see that acting on those vengeful impulses, while temporarily satisfying, would likely create ongoing workplace tension, damage your professional reputation, and keep you mentally churning with negativity, all forms of suffering for yourself. This understanding doesn't mean you ignore the situation. You might still have a private conversation with the colleague, clarify your contribution in subsequent meetings, or take steps to document your ideas more clearly in the future. But you'd approach these actions from a place of clarity rather than vindictiveness, seeking to resolve the situation rather than punish the offender. The doctrine of karma also helps us understand why we experience such strong anger in the first place. Our current tendencies toward anger or patience have been strengthened through countless past actions. If we've habitually responded with anger throughout our lives, those reactions become deeply grooved patterns that automatically activate when triggered. By understanding how these patterns form through repeated action, we gain confidence in our ability to create new, more beneficial patterns through present choices. This perspective is empowering rather than fatalistic. While some misinterpret karma to mean everything is predetermined or whatever happens is deserved, the Buddha's teaching was quite different. He emphasized that while our past actions create tendencies and circumstances, our present choices remain free. At any moment, regardless of our history, we can choose to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity, creating new causes for future well-being. The Buddha illustrated this principle with a salt metaphor. If you put a spoonful of salt in a small cup of water, the water becomes undrinkably salty. But if you put that same spoonful in a large, clear lake, the water remains drinkable because the salt is so diluted. Similarly, the consequences of harmful actions might overwhelm someone with limited positive karma, while the same action might hardly affect someone who has developed extensive goodness and wisdom. This demonstrates how we can work with karmic patterns rather than being helplessly subject to them. Understanding karma also transforms how we view people who harm us. When someone acts harmfully, the teaching of karma reveals that they are creating causes for their own future suffering, rather than focusing solely on how their actions affected us. We recognize that they are harming themselves through their behavior. This naturally evokes compassion rather than hatred, much as we might feel compassion for someone who, not understanding the consequences, drinks poison thinking it's medicine. This doesn't mean we excuse harmful behavior or fail to establish appropriate consequences. In fact, allowing someone to continue harmful actions without appropriate feedback or boundaries could contribute to their continued negative karma. True compassion sometimes requires firm boundaries and clear feedback. The difference is in the underlying motivation, acting from concern for everyone's well-being rather than from a desire to punish or get revenge. Buddhist teachings on karma also help us make sense of situations where we face harm despite our best efforts to live ethically. rather than getting caught in questions like, why me? Or, what did I do to deserve this? We understand that complex streams of causes and conditions from the past are ripening in the present. This doesn't mean we deserve to be harmed or should passively accept mistreatment, but it helps us avoid adding the additional suffering of victimhood narratives on top of the original difficulty. The practical application of karma to transform anger involves bringing awareness to the moment when we feel provoked. We pause, recognizing that how we respond in this moment will create causes for our future experience. We ask ourselves, what kind of seeds do I want to plant right now? What kind of harvest am I creating for my future self and others? This reflection creates space for wiser choices beyond automatic reactivity. Over time, understanding karma fundamentally shifts our relationship with anger. Instead of seeing anger as a justified response to provocation that others make us feel, we recognize it as an arising from complex conditions, including our own mental habits and past choices. This shift from blaming others to taking responsibility for our own emotional responses is tremendously empowering. It means that regardless of how others behave, we always have a choice about how we respond. This understanding of karma connects deeply with the Buddhist insight practice of vipassana discussed earlier, calm. Through vipassana, we directly observe how mental states arise from causes and pass away naturally. The doctrine of karma extends this understanding to the broader patterns of our lives, showing how actions rooted in anger create more suffering while those rooted in clarity create greater peace. The Buddhist approach to karma and anger ultimately reveals a profound choice that's always available to us. We can continue participating in cycles of harm and retaliation that have characterized human history for millennia, or we can make the courageous choice to respond differently, creating new patterns that lead toward healing and peace. This choice is available in each moment, regardless of how justified our anger might feel or how harmful others' actions might be. This understanding of how our actions create our future experience naturally leads to another profound Buddhist teaching that helps transform anger, the meditation on emptiness, or sunyata, while karma helps us work skillfully with the causes and effects of anger. Emptiness meditation goes to the root by revealing the insubstantial nature of the resentments we hold. Sunyata, often translated as emptiness, is one of Buddhism's most profound and frequently misunderstood teachings. It doesn't mean that nothing exists or that life is meaningless. Rather, it points to the fact that all phenomena, including our experiences of self, others, and the resentments we carry, lack independent, inherent existence. Everything arises dependently, without a solid, unchanging essence. This teaching is particularly relevant for working with anger and resentment because these emotions typically involve a strong sense of solidity and permanence. When we're angry at someone, we tend to see them as inherently flawed or bad. Our grievances feel solid and real, fixed facts about reality rather than constructed interpretations. The story of how we were wronged can become so substantial in our minds that we carry it for years or even decades, defining both ourselves and others by these hardened narratives. Emptiness meditation provides a powerful method for investigating and ultimately dissolving these solid-seeming resentments. The practice begins with establishing a foundation of mental stability through focused attention, similar to the beginning stages of vipassana practice. Once the mind is somewhat settled, we turn our attention to examining the true nature of the anger or resentment we're experiencing. One approach is to investigate where exactly the anger is located. We search the body. Is it in the chest? The stomach? The face? We examine our thoughts. Is the anger found in the stories we're telling ourselves? We look at sensations. Is the anger in the heat or tension we're feeling? This detailed investigation typically reveals that we can't locate any solid, independent thing called anger anywhere. There are sensations, thoughts, and feelings that are constantly changing, but no fixed entity that we can point to and say, this is anger. Similarly, we can investigate the apparent targets of our anger. When we're resentful towards someone, we tend to see them as inherently, permanently flawed in some way. He's selfish. She's inconsiderate. They're dishonest. Emptiness meditation invites us to question these fixed views by recognizing that all people are constantly changing collections of countless causes and conditions, without any fixed, unchanging essence. A classic Buddhist analogy compares our normal perception to mistaking a rope for a snake in dim light. We see something coiled on the path ahead and immediately react with fear, treating the perception as solid reality. But when we shine the light of awareness on the situation, we discover there was never a snake there at all, just a rope misperceived. Similarly, emptiness meditation shines the light of awareness on our solid-seeming resentments, revealing that they lack the inherent existence we attributed to them. This investigation isn't merely intellectual, it's a direct exploration of our lived experience. We're not trying to convince ourselves philosophically that resentments are empty. We're looking closely at our actual experience to see if we can find the solid, independent entities we've been reacting to. When we can't find them, when we recognize the empty, constructed nature of both self and other and the resentment between them, something profound shifts in our relationship with anger. Practical approaches to emptiness meditation often begin with examining simpler experiences before tackling strong emotions like anger. You might start by investigating the apparent solidity of physical objects, noticing how their existence depends on countless factors. The materials they're made of, the people who created them, your perception of them, the concepts and labels you apply, and so on. As you recognize the dependent, constructed nature of seemingly solid objects, you can gradually apply this same insight to more complex experiences like emotional reactions and interpersonal conflicts. When working specifically with resentment, you might begin by noticing how your perception of the person you're angry with changes based on your mood, recent interactions, what others have said about them, and countless other factors. This reveals that your perception isn't directly contacting some fixed, inherent nature of the person, but is itself a constantly changing construction based on many conditions. You might also investigate the stories you tell yourself about how you were wronged. When examined closely, these narratives often reveal themselves to be selective interpretations rather than objective facts. Certain aspects of the situation are emphasized while others are ignored. Assumptions are made about others' intentions. Past experiences color how current events are perceived. This doesn't mean your hurt isn't real, but that the solid, fixed narrative you've constructed about it may not be as substantial as it appears. The practice of emptiness meditation doesn't aim to invalidate your experiences or suggest that harmful behavior doesn't matter. Rather, it helps you hold these experiences more lightly, without the additional suffering that comes from solidifying them into fixed narratives about yourself, others, and what happened. It's a middle way between the extremes of clinging to resentments as solid truths and denying that anything happened at all. Many people initially find emptiness meditation challenging or even threatening. If I recognize the empty nature of myself and my experiences, won't I lose something essential? Won't I become passive in the face of injustice? These concerns arise from misunderstanding emptiness as nihilism or non-existence. In fact, recognizing emptiness doesn't mean we or our experiences don't exist. It means they exist in a more fluid, interdependent way than our habitual perception suggests. Far from leading to passivity, the recognition of emptiness can actually empower more effective action in difficult situations. When we're not fixated on solid narratives about who's right and who's wrong, we can respond more flexibly and creatively to challenges. We're less likely to get caught in rigid positions that escalate conflicts, and more able to see multiple perspectives and potential solutions. The Tibetan Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh describes how emptiness practice transforms our experience. When we look at the ocean, dot, we see that each wave has a beginning and an end. A wave can be compared with other waves, and we can call it more or less beautiful, higher or lower, longer lasting or less long lasting. But if we look more deeply, we see that a wave is made of water. While living the life of a wave, the wave also lives the life of water. It would be sad if the wave did not know that it is water. Similarly, when we recognize the empty nature of our resentments, when we see that they are not solid, independent things but temporary formations arising from countless conditions, we're freed from their grip without denying the experiences that gave rise to them. Just as the wave doesn't disappear when it recognizes itself as water, our experiences don't disappear when we recognize their empty nature, but our relationship with them fundamentally transforms. While emptiness meditation works with the conceptual aspects of anger through insight and investigation, Buddhist traditions also recognize that anger has powerful physical components that need to be addressed directly through the body. This brings us to an important but often overlooked dimension of Buddhist practice: the bodily approaches to working with anger energy. These embodied practices acknowledge that anger isn't just a mental state, but a full-body experience that creates tangible energetic patterns that can be transformed through specific physical techniques. When anger arises, it generates distinctive patterns in our bodies: increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, muscle tension, shallow breathing, and a surge of stress hormones. These physical changes are part of our evolutionary fight-or-flight response and can be extremely powerful. Traditional Buddhist practitioners understood that working effectively with anger requires addressing these bodily components directly, not just through mental contemplation. Various Buddhist traditions have developed specific physical practices for working with and transforming the energy of anger. In Tibetan Buddhism, practitioners learn specialized breathing techniques, physical movements, and visualizations that help channel and transform intense emotional energies. Chinese Buddhist traditions incorporate Qigong practices that work with the body's energy channels to dissolve blockages created by anger and other strong emotions. Japanese Zen includes moving meditations like walking practice and physical labor as ways to process emotional energy. One fundamental approach across many traditions begins with conscious breathing. When anger arises, our breathing typically becomes shallow, rapid, and centered in the upper chest. Buddhist physical practices often start by deliberately shifting to deeper, slower breathing that engages the diaphragm and lower abdomen. This physiological shift helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response, counteracting the sympathetic arousal, fight or flight, that accompanies anger. A simple but powerful breathing practice involves counting the length of your inhalations and exhalations, gradually extending the exhale until it's roughly twice as long as the inhale. For example, you might breathe in for a count of 3 and out for a count of 6. This extended exhalation has been shown to reduce heart rate and blood pressure, directly counteracting anger's physical effects. The practice can be done anywhere, during a difficult conversation, while stuck in traffic, or whenever you notice anger arising. Beyond basic breathing techniques, many Buddhist traditions teach specific body postures and movements that help transform anger energy. These might include gentle stretching to release tension in areas where anger typically accumulates: the jaw, shoulders, chest, and belly. Some practices involve more vigorous movements to help channel the high energy of anger constructively rather than suppressing it. In the Tibetan tradition, practitioners sometimes use dynamic visualizations combined with physical movements. One such practice involves visualizing anger as a dark dot, hot smoke or flame in the center of your chest. As you inhale, you imagine drawing this energy upward through the central channel of the body. As you exhale, you visualize it shooting out through the crown of your head as pure, clear light. This practice doesn't suppress anger's energy, but transforms it through conscious direction and visualization. Buddhist tantric traditions take this approach even further, teaching that the intense energy of emotions like anger can be a powerful fuel for spiritual transformation when worked with skillfully. Rather than seeing anger as something to be eliminated, these traditions view it as raw energy that, when recognized and channeled properly, can manifest as clarity, decisiveness, and even compassion. The key is learning to separate the raw energy from the destructive thought patterns that usually accompany it. Zen traditions emphasize the importance of physical posture in working with all emotions, including anger. The stable, grounded posture of zazen, seated meditation, provides a container that can hold intense emotional energy without suppression or expression. Maintaining proper physical alignment during emotional turbulence helps prevent energy from becoming blocked or scattered, allowing it to move through the body and transform naturally. Moving meditation practices like kinhin, walking meditation, or samu, work practice, in Zen offer ways to process emotional energy through mindful physical activity. These practices involve bringing full awareness to simple physical movements and tasks, allowing emotional energy to flow and transform through engaged activity rather than mental rumination. Modern scientific research has begun to validate these traditional approaches to working with emotions through the body. Studies in psychophysiology show that emotional states create distinct patterns of muscle tension, hormone release, and nervous system activation. Deliberately changing these physical patterns through practices like conscious breathing, movement, and posture can directly affect emotional states, creating a bottom-up approach to emotional regulation that complements top-down cognitive approaches. The field of somatic psychology has particularly embraced this understanding, developing approaches that recognize how emotions and trauma are stored in the body and need to be addressed physically as well as mentally. These modern approaches have many parallels with traditional Buddhist embodied practices for working with difficult emotions. An important principle in Buddhist physical practices for working with anger is avoiding both suppression and indulgence. Suppressing anger's physical energy often leads to chronic tension, stress-related illness, or explosive outbursts when the pressure becomes too great. Conversely, habitually expressing anger through yelling or physical aggression reinforces these patterns and often escalates conflicts. Buddhist embodied practices offer a middle path, acknowledging and working consciously with anger's energy rather than either suppressing or expressing it unconsciously. These physical approaches are particularly helpful for people who tend to process emotions more somatically than cognitively. Some individuals naturally feel emotions primarily in their bodies rather than as thoughts or mental states. For these people, purely cognitive approaches to anger management may be less effective than practices that directly address the bodily experience of anger in daily life. These embodied practices can be integrated in simple but powerful ways. You might develop awareness of your personal physical signature of anger, the specific places in your body where you tend to hold tension when angry. Once identified, you can use this awareness as an early warning system, noticing these physical signals before anger fully takes over. You can then apply specific breathing techniques or movements to work with the emerging anger energy. For particularly intense or chronic anger, more intensive physical practices may be helpful. Some Buddhist centers offer retreats specifically focused on embodied approaches to emotional transformation. These might include periods of dynamic movement, expressive practices that allow the safe release of emotional energy, and guided visualizations combined with physical awareness. The integration of physical practices with mental approaches creates a comprehensive method for working with anger. While meditation and contemplation help us understand anger's empty nature and the karma it creates, physical practices help us work directly with its raw energy. Together, these approaches address anger on multiple levels, creating the conditions for genuine transformation rather than mere suppression or management. These embodied approaches to working with anger naturally complement another essential element of Buddhist practice, the cultivation of ethical conduct, or sila. While physical practices help transform anger's energy in the moment, Ethical conduct creates the conditions for a mind less prone to anger and resentment in the first place. Sila, which can be translated as ethical conduct or moral discipline, is considered the foundation of Buddhist practice. It's traditionally described as the first of the three trainings, along with concentration and wisdom, and provides the stable base upon which all other aspects of practice are built. Far from being a restrictive set of rules imposed from outside, Buddhist ethics is understood as a practical method for creating the conditions for mental well-being and spiritual development. The connection between ethical conduct and anger transformation is direct and powerful. When we live in accordance with ethical principles, we create fewer situations that lead to regret, guilt, and internal conflict, all states that often manifest as anger directed either inward at ourselves or projected outward onto others. By establishing a foundation of ethical behavior, we reduce these sources of inner turmoil that frequently fuel angry reactions. The basic ethical guidelines in Buddhism are expressed in the 5 precepts observed by lay practitioners: avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, and intoxication. These aren't framed as commandments, but as training principles voluntarily adopted to create greater harmony and reduce suffering for oneself and others. By following these guidelines, we avoid actions that inevitably lead to inner conflict and disturbance. Consider how this works in practice. When we speak harshly or dishonestly to someone, we might momentarily feel a sense of release or satisfaction, but this is typically followed by a subtle or not so subtle sense of unease. We may become defensive, anticipating negative reactions. We might feel a need to justify our behavior, even to ourselves. This inner conflict often manifests as irritability or anger that gets projected onto others. Conversely, when we communicate truthfully and kindly, we don't create this internal discord that fuels anger. Similarly, when we respect others' property and boundaries, avoiding stealing in its many forms, we don't generate the internal tension that comes from knowing we've violated social trust. When we avoid intoxication, we maintain the mental clarity needed to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively to provocations. Each ethical guideline, when followed, helps create the internal conditions for greater emotional regulation and less reactivity. Beyond avoiding harmful actions, Buddhist ethics also emphasizes cultivating positive qualities through our behavior. The Buddha spoke of the 10 skillful actions: generosity, ethical conduct, meditation, showing respect, being of service, sharing merit, rejoicing in others' goodness, listening to teachings, teaching others, and straightening one's views. Actively cultivating these positive behaviors creates a mind state less susceptible to anger and resentment. For example, the practice of generosity naturally counteracts the self-centered mindset that often underlies anger. When we're caught in anger, we're typically highly focused on our own perspective, our own rights, our own needs. Regular acts of generosity, whether giving material goods, time, attention, or emotional support, help expand our awareness beyond this narrow focus. Studies in positive psychology confirm that generosity and volunteering are associated with improved mood and reduced stress reactivity, both factors that help prevent angry reactions. The practice of respect toward teachers, elders, peers, and even those we disagree with, similarly creates mental habits that reduce anger's grip. When we maintain an attitude of basic respect toward others, we're less likely to dehumanize them when conflicts arise. This doesn't mean we can't disagree strongly or set firm boundaries, but that we do so while recognizing others' fundamental dignity and humanity. Buddhist ethical training particularly emphasizes mindfulness of speech, recognizing how powerfully our words affect both others and our own mental states. The Buddha advised that before speaking, we should consider whether what we plan to say is true, beneficial, and timely. Speech that meets these criteria is much less likely to generate the regret and defensiveness that often fuel anger, both in ourselves and others. Worse. Importantly, Buddhist ethics isn't about achieving moral perfection or never making mistakes. It's a training approach that recognizes we'll sometimes fall short, and those moments become opportunities for learning rather than self-condemnation. When we do act in ways that violate our ethical principles, Buddhist practice encourages acknowledging the mistake, making amends when possible, and recommitting to ethical conduct without excessive guilt or self-judgment, states that often transform into anger directed at ourselves or others. This balanced approach to ethics helps prevent the rigid self-judgment that can actually increase anger. Some people attempt to follow moral rules out of fear or harsh self-discipline, creating internal pressure that eventually erupts as resentment. Buddhist ethical training emphasizes understanding the natural consequences of our actions rather than following rules out of fear of punishment. This understanding-based approach creates sustainable ethical behavior that reduces rather than generates anger. Modern psychological research strongly supports the connection between ethical behavior and emotional well-being. Studies show that people who live in alignment with their core values experience less internal conflict and greater psychological integration. Conversely, when our actions repeatedly contradict our values, a state psychologists call moral incongruence, we experience increased stress, anxiety, and negative emotions, including anger. The practice of ethical conduct creates a virtuous cycle that supports anger transformation. As we act more ethically, we experience less regret and inner conflict, which reduces our baseline level of stress and irritability. This makes us less reactive when provocations arise. Less reactivity leads to fewer regrettable actions, further reducing sources of inner conflict. Over time, this positive cycle creates a mind increasingly characterized by clarity and peace rather than agitation and anger. In practical terms, how might someone use ethical conduct as a foundation for anger transformation? You might begin by reflecting on which aspects of your behavior tend to create regret or inner conflict that later manifests as irritability or anger. Perhaps it's speaking impulsively in ways you later wish you hadn't, or making commitments you can't fulfill, or using substances that cloud your judgment. Identifying these patterns allows you to focus your ethical practice where it's most needed for reducing anger. You might then establish specific intentions around these areas, not as rigid rules but as training guidelines. For example, I intend to pause and take a breath before responding when I feel provoked. Or, I intend to be realistic about what I can accomplish so I don't overcommit and then feel resentful. Regular reflection on how well you're meeting these intentions, ideally with an attitude of kind curiosity rather than harsh judgment, helps strengthen ethical behavior that reduces anger's causes. Community support can be particularly valuable in ethical practice. Buddhist practitioners traditionally take ethical precepts in the presence of spiritual friends or teachers, creating accountability and support for their ethical intentions. Similarly, having friends or family members who share your commitment to reducing harm through ethical behavior can provide encouragement and feedback that helps maintain your practice even in challenging circumstances. Buddhist ethical training recognizes that our behavior, thoughts, and emotions form an interconnected system where each element influences the others. By consciously shaping our behavior through ethical guidelines, we indirectly but powerfully influence our emotional patterns, including our tendency toward anger and resentment. This approach complements the direct work with anger through meditation and embodied practices, creating a comprehensive method for transforming this challenging emotion. The practice of ethical conduct creates the conditions for a mind less prone to anger and resentment. Building on this foundation, Buddhist tradition offers another powerful practice that specifically addresses emotions closely related to anger, mudita, the cultivation of sympathetic or altruistic joy. While not directly targeting anger itself, mudita addresses envy, jealousy, and resentment emotions that often transform into anger if left unchecked. Mudita is one of the 4 Brahmaviharas, or divine abodes, along with loving-kindness, metta, compassion, karuna, and equanimity, upekkha, that we explored earlier. These 4 qualities together create a mind capable of responding to any situation with wisdom rather than reactivity. Mudita specifically involves taking genuine pleasure in the happiness, success, and good fortune of others, even when, perhaps especially when, their success exceeds our own. This might sound simple, but it directly challenges one of our most deeply ingrained human tendencies: comparing ourselves to others and feeling diminished by their success. Think about how often you've experienced a subtle twinge of discomfort when hearing about a friend's promotion, a colleague's recognition, or an acquaintance's good fortune. These twinges of envy or resentment, if nurtured, easily transform into full-blown anger or bitterness over time. The Buddha recognized that these comparative and competitive mindsets create tremendous suffering. When we view life through a lens of scarcity and competition, believing that others' gains somehow diminish what's available to us, we create the perfect conditions for resentment and anger to flourish. Mudita practice directly counters this by training us to genuinely celebrate others' happiness and success. Practicing mudita begins with recognizing how envy, jealousy, and competitive feelings actually affect us, far from protecting our interests or motivating us toward success. These emotions typically create significant suffering. They narrow our perspective, keep us focused on what we lack rather than what we have, and poison potential friendships and collaborations with suspicion and resentment. By seeing clearly how these emotions harm us, we naturally become motivated to cultivate their opposite, sympathetic joy. The formal practice of mudita follows a structure similar to metta meditation. Sitting in a comfortable posture, we begin by connecting with our own joy and good fortune. We might reflect on moments of happiness in our lives, accomplishments we're proud of, or simple pleasures we've experienced. Establishing this connection with our own joy creates the foundation for genuinely appreciating others' happiness without feeling threatened by it. We then extend this appreciation outward, typically beginning with someone whose happiness is easy to enjoy, perhaps a child, a dear friend, or someone who has supported us. We might silently repeat phrases like, "I'm happy that you're happy. May your success and good fortune continue and grow." As we do this, we try to genuinely feel the warmth and expansiveness that comes from taking pleasure in another's well-being. Gradually, we extend this practice to include neutral people and eventually to those we find difficult or even those we've envied or resented. This progressive extension helps break down the arbitrary boundaries that determine whose happiness we can celebrate and whose success triggers our envy or resentment. The ultimate aim is to develop a mind that can genuinely rejoice in anyone's good fortune, recognizing that happiness and success aren't limited resources to be competed for but can be celebrated wherever they appear. What makes mudita such an effective antidote to anger-producing emotions like envy and resentment? First, it directly counters the mental habit of turning others' success into our failure. When we practice taking genuine pleasure in others' happiness, we disrupt the comparative thinking that fuels resentment. Instead of seeing someone's success as highlighting our inadequacy, we learn to appreciate it as a genuine good that doesn't diminish us in any way. Second, mudita practice helps us recognize that happiness isn't a zero-sum game. When someone else experiences joy, success, or recognition, nothing is taken away from us. In fact, when we can genuinely celebrate with them, their happiness becomes a source of joy for us as well, effectively increasing the total amount of happiness in our lives rather than diminishing it. Third, regular mudita practice gradually transforms our overall perspective from one of scarcity to one of abundance. Instead of seeing a world of limited resources and opportunities where we must compete against others for our share, we begin to recognize the endless possibilities for joy, success, and fulfillment available to everyone. This abundance perspective naturally reduces the resentment and anger that stem from perceived scarcity. The shift mudita creates isn't just psychological. It has practical effects on our relationships and opportunities. When we can genuinely celebrate others' success without envy, we become the kind of person others want to be around and collaborate with. Rather than being perceived as competitive or resentful, we're seen as supportive and encouraging. This often leads to stronger relationships, more collaborations, and ironically, more opportunities for our own success, creating a virtuous cycle that further reduces the conditions for anger and resentment. In daily life, mudita can be practiced informally whenever we encounter others' good fortune. When a friend shares news of an achievement, instead of immediately comparing it to our own situation, we can take a moment to genuinely celebrate with them, noticing any envy that arises without being controlled by it. When scrolling through social media and seeing others' apparent happiness or success, rather than falling into comparison or cynicism, we can practice genuinely wishing them well. Interestingly, modern research in positive psychology has begun to validate the benefits of practices similar to mudita. Studies on capitalizing, the process of responding positively to others' good news, show that people who can genuinely celebrate others' successes have stronger relationships, better well-being, and even experience more success themselves. This research suggests that the ancient Buddhist practice of mudita isn't just spiritually beneficial, but practically advantageous as well. For those struggling with strong feelings of envy or resentment that lead to anger, beginning with small, manageable instances of mudita practice can help build this capacity gradually. You might start by celebrating the success of people you already feel supportive toward, or by focusing on accomplishments in areas you don't personally compete in. As your capacity for sympathetic joy strengthens, you can gradually extend it to more challenging situations. It's worth noting that mudita doesn't mean suppressing or denying legitimate feelings of envy or resentment when they arise. Rather, it involves acknowledging these feelings with mindfulness while choosing to cultivate a different response. You might notice, envy is arising right now, and then deliberately shift your attention to genuinely appreciating whatever can be appreciated about the other person's situation. Over time, this practice creates new neural pathways that make sympathetic joy more automatic and natural. The cultivation of mudita connects back to the ethical foundation discussed earlier. When we live ethically, we create the conditions for genuine self-respect that makes us less vulnerable to comparative thinking and envy. Conversely, the practice of mudita supports ethical behavior by reducing the competitive mindset that sometimes drives unethical actions aimed at getting ahead or preventing others' success. Through consistent practice, mudita gradually transforms our relationship not just with others' success, but with the very notion of success itself. Instead of seeing success as a limited resource that some win and others lose, we begin to recognize and celebrate the infinite varieties of human accomplishment and happiness. This expansive perspective naturally dissolves the breeding grounds of resentment and anger, creating a mind characterized by appreciation and joy rather than comparison and envy. This practice of cultivating sympathetic joy connects naturally with another profound Buddhist teaching that helps transform anger, pratitya samutpada, or the principle of dependent origination. While mudita addresses specific emotions like envy that often lead to anger, understanding dependent origination helps us work with anger itself by revealing how it arises through complex chains of causes and conditions. Pratitya samutpada, sometimes translated as dependent origination or interdependent co-arising, is one of Buddhism's most fundamental teachings. In simple terms, it explains that nothing exists independently. Everything arises due to multiple causes and conditions. The Buddha considered this principle so profound that he once stated, "One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma, and one who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination. When applied to anger, this principle offers a revolutionary perspective. Rather than seeing anger as something that simply happens to us or as an inevitable reaction to certain triggers, we recognize it as a complex process that depends on numerous factors coming together. These factors include not just the immediate trigger, but also our physical state, past experiences, beliefs, expectations, cultural conditioning, and many other elements. This understanding immediately gives us more options for working with anger. If anger isn't a simple, fixed reaction, but a complex process dependent on many factors, then changing any of these factors can influence whether and how anger arises. This shifts us from feeling helplessly subject to anger to recognizing the multiple points where we can potentially intervene in the process. Consider a practical example. Imagine you're driving and someone cuts you off in traffic. The immediate reaction might be anger. From a conventional perspective, it's easy to believe that the other driver made you angry, as if anger were the only possible response to that situation. But through the lens of dependent origination, you can recognize that many factors are contributing to this anger. Your physical state, are you tired, hungry, or rushed? Affects your threshold for irritation. Your expectations about how others should drive influence whether you perceive the action as a violation. Your interpretations about the other driver's intentions, did they cut you off deliberately or simply not see you? Shape your emotional response. Your past experiences with similar situations have created habitual reaction patterns that automatically activate. Your cultural conditioning about what constitutes respectful behavior on the road frames how you interpret the event. Seeing this complex web of conditions doesn't mean you can immediately prevent anger from arising, but it does provide multiple entry points for working with it. You might address your physical needs by making sure you're well rested and fed before driving. You could examine your expectations about other drivers' behavior, recognizing that people make mistakes and have their own pressing concerns. You might practice suspending judgment about others' intentions, acknowledging that you can't actually know why someone drove as they did. You can work with habitual reaction patterns through meditation practices like those we've discussed. And you can reflect on cultural conditioning that might be intensifying your reactions. The Buddha illustrated dependent origination through a chain of 12 links, showing how suffering arises from ignorance through a series of conditional steps. While the full 12-link chain is quite detailed, even a simplified understanding helps us work with anger more effectively. We begin to see that anger doesn't simply appear out of nowhere. It follows a sequence that typically includes a sensory contact, an initial feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, a perception or interpretation of what happened, and various mental formations including thoughts and emotions. This sequence happens so quickly that it usually feels instantaneous, but with mindfulness practice, we can start to distinguish these stages and find the spaces between them. These spaces represent opportunities for choice rather than automatic reactivity. For instance, we might notice an unpleasant feeling arising, stage 2, without immediately moving to a negative interpretation, stage 3. Or we might notice a negative interpretation forming without automatically believing and amplifying it. Understanding dependent origination also helps us recognize that the people who trigger our anger are themselves acting based on countless causes and conditions. Their behavior doesn't emerge from some fixed, inherent nature, but from their own complex web of past experiences, current circumstances, physical states, beliefs, and conditioning. This recognition doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but helps us see it in a broader context that makes compassion more possible than when we attribute it simply to bad character. This broader perspective naturally reduces the personalization that often intensifies anger. When someone acts in a way that triggers us, we typically create a story about how their action was deliberately aimed at us or says something significant about their feelings toward us. Recognizing the complex web of causes behind all behavior helps us see that most actions have little to do with us personally. They're the result of countless factors largely unrelated to us. The principle of dependent origination also reveals why attempting to suppress or ignore anger rarely works in the long run. If anger arises due to specific causes and conditions, simply trying to force it away doesn't address these underlying factors. It's like trying to stop a plant from growing by cutting off its leaves while leaving the roots intact. Effective anger transformation requires understanding and working with the full range of conditions that give rise to it. In practical terms, how might someone apply this understanding to work with anger? One approach involves tracing back the chain of dependent origination when anger arises. You might ask yourself, what physical sensations preceded this anger? What perceptions or interpretations am I making about this situation? What past experiences might be influencing my reaction? What expectations or desires are being frustrated? This investigation helps reveal the complex, conditioned nature of anger rather than seeing it as a simple, inevitable reaction. Another practical application involves deliberately changing conditions that contribute to anger. If you notice that hunger, fatigue, or stress significantly lowers your threshold for irritation, you might prioritize addressing these physical needs as part of your approach to anger management. If certain environments or activities consistently trigger anger, you might temporarily modify your exposure to them while developing stronger mindfulness skills. Understanding dependent origination also helps us work more effectively with recurring anger in specific relationships. Rather than seeing the other person as inherently difficult or deliberately provoking us, we can investigate the specific conditions that repeatedly lead to conflict. These might include mismatched expectations, communication patterns that escalate tension, unresolved past issues, or external pressures affecting the relationship. Addressing these specific conditions often reduces anger more effectively than trying to change the other person's nature or behavior directly. Perhaps most importantly, the principle of dependent origination gives us confidence that transformation is possible. If anger were an inherent, fixed part of who we are, changing our relationship with it would be impossible. But if anger is a conditioned process arising from specific causes, then changing those causes can significantly alter how and whether anger arises. This doesn't mean we'll never experience anger again, but that we can gradually create the conditions for less reactivity, greater awareness of anger as it begins, and wiser responses when it does arise. Understanding dependent origination connects back to many of the practices we've explored previously. Mindfulness meditation helps us observe the conditioned arising of anger in real time. Loving kindness and compassion practices create new conditions that make anger less likely to arise or escalate. Ethical conduct removes many of the conditions that lead to regret and self-directed anger. Together, these practices create a comprehensive approach to transforming anger by addressing all the links in its chain of dependent origination. This understanding of how anger arises through complex conditions rather than as a simple, fixed reaction gives us tremendous freedom. Instead of being passive victims of our emotional reactions or struggling to control them through willpower alone, we become skilled gardeners of our inner landscape, understanding exactly which conditions create the fertile ground for anger and systematically cultivating different conditions that support greater peace, clarity, and compassionate response. The understanding of dependent origination shows us that transformation of anger isn't simply an individual effort, but happens within a complex web of conditions. This brings us to another essential aspect of Buddhist practice for working with anger: the role of community, or Sangha. While many Western approaches to anger management focus exclusively on individual techniques and personal responsibility, Buddhism has always recognized that meaningful transformation happens within supportive community contexts. Sangha, one of the three jewels or refugees in Buddhism along with the Buddha and the Dharma, refers to the community of practitioners who support each other on the path. The Buddha emphasized the importance of spiritual friendship, once telling his attendant Ananda that admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. This wasn't an exaggeration, but a recognition that our environment and relationships powerfully shape our mental habits, including our tendencies toward anger and resentment. When it comes to transforming anger, community provides several crucial elements that are difficult to develop alone. First, community offers mirrors that help us see our blind spots. We all have anger patterns that are invisible to us but obvious to others. In a healthy spiritual community, we receive feedback about these patterns from people who are committed to our well-being rather than trying to win arguments or prove us wrong. This feedback, while sometimes uncomfortable to hear, is invaluable for recognizing habitual anger responses we might otherwise miss. A friend of mine experienced this when she joined a meditation group that included structured dialogue practices. During one session, several people gently pointed out that her communication style often included subtle put-downs and competitive elements she wasn't aware of. Initially defensive, she gradually recognized that these habits stemmed from insecurity and were creating unnecessary tension in her relationships. Without the mirror of community, she might have continued these patterns indefinitely, wondering why her relationships often became contentious. Second, community provides living examples of people who have transformed their relationship with anger. Seeing others respond with patience and clarity in situations that would have triggered us helps us recognize what's possible. These role models aren't perfect. They still experience anger, but they demonstrate how to work with it skillfully rather than being controlled by it. Their example gives us confidence that change is possible and provides practical templates for how transformation might look in everyday life. Third, healthy spiritual communities offer specific practices and structures for working with interpersonal conflicts when they inevitably arise. Many Buddhist communities have developed structured processes for addressing tensions and resolving disagreements. These might include formal reconciliation practices, council circles where each person speaks without interruption, or communication guidelines that help maintain respect and openness even during difficult conversations. For example, in some Zen communities, when conflicts arise between members, there's a practice called beginning anew, where people gather in a circle with trained facilitators. Each person has the opportunity to speak about their experience without interruption or debate, focusing on their own feelings and needs rather than blaming others. This structured space allows for authentic expression of hurt or anger while preventing the escalation that typically happens in unstructured conflicts. Fourth, community provides opportunities to practice new responses to anger triggers in relatively safe contexts. Many Buddhist communities deliberately incorporate practices that challenge our habitual patterns, whether through communal living arrangements, work practice, or structured interactions. These situations inevitably bring up irritations and conflicts that might be avoided in more isolated practice. With the support of shared values and practices, these challenging moments become opportunities to try new responses rather than reverting to old anger patterns. During a month-long retreat at a monastery, I watched this process unfold among the participants. Living in close quarters, sharing chores, and facing the frustrations of intensive practice inevitably brought up irritations. But the community context made these challenges productive rather than merely annoying. When someone reacted with anger to another person using the last of the hot water, the situation became an opportunity for reflection and growth rather than just another annoyance to complain about. Fifth, community helps sustain our practice during periods when motivation wanes or challenges seem overwhelming. We all go through phases where anger feels particularly intense or transformation seems impossible. During these times, the encouragement and support of others who have faced similar struggles can be crucial for maintaining practice rather than giving up. Knowing that others have worked through similar difficulties and found their way to greater peace gives us hope when our own path seems blocked. It's worth noting that not all communities are equally helpful for anger transformation. Communities based on rigid hierarchy, unquestioning obedience, or suppression of negative emotions may actually reinforce unhealthy patterns rather than supporting genuine transformation. Healthy spiritual communities acknowledge the reality of difficult emotions like anger while providing supportive contexts for working with them skillfully. They allow for authentic expression without indulging harmful speech or actions. The ideal community for anger transformation combines several qualities: clear shared values and practices that support emotional awareness, skilled elders or teachers who model healthy ways of working with anger, structures for addressing conflicts when they arise, an atmosphere of psychological safety where people can be authentic without fear of rejection, and a balance between compassionate acceptance and encouragement toward growth. For those without access to formal Buddhist communities, even small groups of friends committed to similar values can serve many of the functions of Sangha, meeting regularly with even 2 or 3 others to discuss challenges, share practices, and offer feedback creates many of the benefits of larger spiritual communities. Online communities can also provide support, though the face-to-face element of traditional Sangha offers dimensions that are difficult to replicate digitally. How might someone effectively use community support for working with anger? First, by being honest about your struggles rather than presenting only your most composed self to others. When we hide our difficulties with anger, we miss the opportunity for the supportive feedback and guidance that community can offer. This doesn't mean using community as a place to vent or act out anger, but rather to acknowledge challenges and seek support in working with them skillfully. Second, by actively seeking feedback about anger patterns that might be invisible to you. You might ask trusted friends, "Have you noticed patterns in what triggers my anger?" Or, "Are there ways my communication comes across as harsh that I might not be aware of?" This requires creating relationships where others feel safe to offer honest observations without fear of defensive reactions. Third, by deliberately exposing yourself to the example of those who demonstrate skill in working with anger. This might mean spending time with more experienced practitioners, attending retreats led by skilled teachers, or even reading accounts of how others have transformed their relationship with anger. These examples provide both inspiration and practical guidance for your own path. Fourth, by participating in group practices specifically designed to work with difficult emotions. Many Buddhist centers offer courses or retreat programs focused on transforming anger and cultivating positive alternatives like loving kindness and compassion. The combination of structured practice and group support can accelerate transformation beyond what might be possible through individual practice alone. The Buddha's emphasis on Sangha reflects a profound understanding of human psychology. We are fundamentally shaped by our social environments, and lasting change typically requires supportive community rather than isolated effort. By consciously creating and participating in communities that support emotional awareness and skillful responses to anger, we establish conditions that make transformation not only possible, but natural and sustainable. The supportive context of community helps us recognize and work with what Buddhism identifies as the 5 hindrances or obstacles to mental clarity and peace. Among these 5, the second hindrance, ill will or aversion, is directly connected to anger and resentment. Understanding anger within this broader framework of mental obstacles offers powerful insights for its transformation. The 5 hindrances in Buddhist psychology are sensual desire, aversion, doubt, restlessness, and worry; ill will, sloth and torpor; restlessness and worry; and doubt. These are not seen as moral failings but as common mental states that obscure clear seeing and prevent the mind from settling into deeper states of meditation and wisdom. The Buddha compared them to impurities that cloud water, making it impossible to see clearly to the bottom of a pool. Ill will, the second hindrance, encompasses the spectrum of aversive emotions from mild irritation to intense hatred. when present. This hindrance colors our perception, making it impossible to see situations or people clearly. Just as red-tinted glasses make everything appear red, the presence of ill will makes everything about a person or situation appear negative, threatening, or worthy of criticism. The Buddha offered specific antidotes for each of the hindrances. For ill will, the primary antidote is the cultivation of loving kindness, metta, that we explored earlier. This isn't about forcing positive feelings, but systematically developing an alternative heart quality that naturally displaces aversion. Other antidotes include reflecting on the consequences of harboring ill will, how it harms us first and foremost, developing compassion by considering the suffering of those who provoke us, and practicing equanimity toward difficult experiences. What makes the 5 hindrances framework particularly helpful for working with anger is that it normalizes these challenging emotions while simultaneously providing specific methods for their transformation. Rather than seeing anger as evidence of personal failure or spiritual inadequacy, we recognize it as a common human obstacle that all practitioners face and that specific practices can address. This framework also helps us understand the interconnected nature of mental obstacles. Often anger doesn't arise in isolation, but in connection with other hindrances. For example, restlessness and worry, the 4th hindrance, can make us more irritable and prone to anger. Doubt, the 5th hindrance, might manifest as cynicism that fuels resentment toward others or spiritual practices. By working with the full spectrum of hindrances rather than focusing exclusively on anger, we create comprehensive conditions for mental clarity and peace. In practical terms, how might someone use this framework to work with anger? First, by learning to recognize ill will in its various manifestations, from subtle irritation to full-blown rage, from momentary annoyance to long-term resentment. The simple act of identifying, this is the hindrance of ill will, already creates some space around the experience rather than being completely identified with it. Second, by understanding the specific ways this hindrance distorts perception. When caught in ill will, we tend to focus exclusively on others' faults while ignoring their positive qualities. We interpret neutral actions as negative or hostile. We remember past grievances while forgetting kindnesses. Simply recognizing these distortions can help us question the truth of our anger-tinted perceptions. Third, by applying the specific antidotes that Buddhist tradition offers for working with ill will. These include the formal practices of loving-kindness meditation, but also simpler interventions like deliberately bringing to mind something positive about a person who has provoked anger, or reflecting on the shared humanity between yourself and someone who has caused harm. Fourth, by recognizing the impermanent nature of ill will. Like all hindrances, the Buddha emphasized that these obstacles come and go based on conditions. They are not permanent features of the mind. This understanding helps prevent the additional layer of self-judgment that often accompanies anger. I'm such an angry person, or I'll never overcome this resentment. Seeing anger as a passing hindrance rather than a fixed identity creates confidence in the possibility of transformation. The 5 hindrances framework also offers valuable guidance for working with anger during formal meditation practice. When anger arises during meditation, whether toward external circumstances, other people, or even toward yourself or the meditation process, the traditional guidance is neither to suppress it nor to indulge it, but to work with it skillfully using appropriate antidotes. For example, if you find yourself sitting in meditation and becoming increasingly irritated by the sound of construction outside, you might first simply recognize the hindrance of ill will is present. Then you might apply an antidote like extending good wishes toward the workers who are just doing their jobs, or developing equanimity by recognizing that unpleasant sounds, like all phenomena, are impermanent. If the irritation is particularly strong, you might temporarily shift to formal loving-kindness practice before returning to your primary meditation object. What's powerful about this approach is that it transforms obstacles into opportunities. Each time a hindrance like ill will arises and we work with it skillfully, we strengthen our capacity to recognize and transform these mental patterns. Over time, the hindrances don't necessarily stop arising completely, but our relationship with them fundamentally changes. We become less identified with them, less controlled by them, and more skilled at applying the appropriate antidotes when they do appear. The Buddha offered a memorable simile for this process. He compared the mind with hindrances to water that is boiling, muddy, mixed with algae, stirred by the wind, or left in the dark. Just as none of these conditions allow for clear seeing of objects reflected in the water, a mind affected by hindrances cannot see reality clearly. But just as water can be cooled, settled, cleared, calmed, and brought into the light, the mind can be freed from hindrances through appropriate practices. This simile highlights an important point. Working with the hindrances, including ill will, isn't just about feeling better or having more pleasant emotional states. It's about seeing clearly. When the mind is clouded by anger, we cannot perceive ourselves, others, or situations accurately. The primary motivation for transforming anger from a Buddhist perspective is to remove these distortions so that wisdom can arise. Understanding anger as a hindrance to clear seeing rather than just an unpleasant emotion shifts how we approach its transformation. Instead of simply trying to get rid of uncomfortable feelings, we're motivated by the desire to perceive reality more accurately and respond from that clarity. This perspective helps sustain practice even when the immediate emotional benefits aren't apparent, because we recognize that freedom from hindrances serves our deepest aspiration for wisdom and compassionate action. The 5 hindrances framework offers a balanced middle way between two common extreme approaches to anger, indulging it as justified and true versus suppressing it as spiritually inappropriate. By recognizing anger as a normal hindrance that distorts perception while simultaneously offering specific antidotes for working with it, this approach honors our experience while providing practical paths toward transformation. Understanding anger as one of the 5 hindrances gives us a framework for working with it as a common obstacle to clear seeing. This insight connects naturally with another powerful approach from the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the cultivation of bodhicitta, or the awakened heart-mind dedicated to the benefit of all beings. While earlier practices we've explored focus primarily on freeing ourselves from anger's grip, bodhicitta offers a way to transform the energy of anger into motivation for positive change in the world. Bodhicitta, often translated as awakening mind or heart of enlightenment, is the central motivation in Mahayana Buddhism. It's the aspiration to attain full awakening, not for personal benefit alone, but for the welfare of all living beings. This radical shift in perspective, from concern primarily with our own suffering to equal or greater concern for others, creates a powerful context for working with anger in an entirely new way. When motivated by bodhicitta, we begin to see that transforming our relationship with anger isn't just a personal project for our own peace of mind. It becomes an essential part of our capacity to benefit others effectively. We recognize that when caught in reactive anger, our ability to help others is severely compromised. Conversely, when we can transform anger into clear discernment and compassionate action, we become much more effective in addressing the very situations that might otherwise trigger rage or indignation. A key insight of the bodhicitta approach is that people who provoke our anger can be viewed as valuable teachers rather than enemies. The 8th century Buddhist master Shantideva expressed this powerfully when he wrote, "Thus, those who cause me suffering are really offering me a precious treasure. Since they are providing me with this opportunity to practice patience, I should treasure them." From this perspective, difficult people aren't obstacles to our practice but essential partners in developing the very qualities we need for awakening. This doesn't mean we passively accept harmful behavior. In fact, the bodhicitta perspective may lead us to take very direct action to address injustice or prevent harm. The difference lies in the underlying motivation and emotional tone of that action. while ordinary anger seeks to punish, condemn, or defeat perceived enemies. Action motivated by bodhicitta aims to protect and benefit everyone involved, including those whose harmful behavior we're opposing. The classic example of this approach is the Buddha himself, who, according to traditional accounts, sometimes used very direct, even stern methods to stop harmful behavior. Yet accounts consistently describe him as acting from compassion rather than anger, concerned for the welfare of the person causing harm as much as for their potential victims. This combination of directness without hatred demonstrates how bodhicitta transforms the energy of what might otherwise be anger into wise, compassionate action. Practical methods for cultivating this transformation include specific meditations from the Tibetan tradition. One powerful practice called Tonglen, sending and taking, directly challenges our habitual self-centeredness that often fuels angry reactions. In this practice, we visualize breathing in the suffering, confusion, and negativity of others while breathing out relief, clarity, and positive qualities to them. This deliberate reversal of our usual pattern, wanting happiness for ourselves and unconsciously hoping others will take care of their own problems, gradually transforms our relationship with difficult emotions and situations. Another Tibetan practice particularly relevant for transforming anger is exchanging self for others meditation. In this approach, we deliberately place ourselves in others' positions, imagining their experiences, pressures, and perspectives as vividly as possible. When applied to someone who has provoked our anger, this practice helps dissolve the rigid boundary between innocent me and blameworthy them that typically characterizes angry states. We begin to recognize how we might act similarly under similar conditions, developing empathy that transforms anger without excusing harmful behavior. For those involved in social justice work or activism, the bodhicitta approach offers a sustainable alternative to anger-driven activism. Many activists eventually burn out because the anger that initially fuels their work is inherently depleting and often leads to seeing other humans as enemies rather than as confused beings worthy of compassion. Bodhicitta-motivated activism maintains the clarity about what needs to change while transforming the emotional foundation from anger to compassion, creating work that can be sustained over a lifetime without the psychological damage that often accompanies rage-based approaches. The Dalai Lama exemplifies this approach in his response to the Chinese occupation of Tibet. Despite the tremendous suffering inflicted on his people, he consistently advocates non-violent responses based on recognizing the shared humanity of the Chinese people and leaders. This doesn't mean he accepts the occupation as acceptable. He works tirelessly for justice and cultural preservation, but he does so without dehumanizing those responsible for the harm. This balance of clear opposition to harmful actions while maintaining compassion for those committing them demonstrates bodhicitta in action. On a more everyday level, bodhicitta transforms how we might respond to personal slights and offences. Rather than focusing primarily on how we've been wronged, we expand our concern to include the confusion and suffering that led the other person to act harmfully. This broader perspective naturally softens anger without requiring us to suppress our own legitimate hurt or concerns. For example, if a colleague takes credit for your work during a meeting, a bodhicitta approach would involve acknowledging your own feelings of anger or hurt while simultaneously recognizing the insecurity, pressure, or confusion that might lead someone to claim others' achievements as their own. This expanded awareness doesn't mean you don't address the situation. You might still have a direct conversation with the person or clarify your contribution in subsequent communications, but you do so from a place of wishing for everyone's genuine well-being rather than from a desire to punish or humiliate. The development of bodhicitta involves both aspiration and application. We deliberately cultivate the wish for all beings to be free from suffering and its causes, while also actively applying this motivation in increasingly challenging situations. Over time, this practice transforms our default responses to provocations. What once automatically triggered anger now increasingly evokes compassion and wisdom. not because we're suppressing our true feelings, but because our true feelings have themselves transformed through practice. For those new to this approach, starting with relatively minor irritations rather than major triggers is usually more effective. You might practice bringing bodhicitta motivation to small daily annoyances, traffic delays, minor rudeness, technical frustrations, before attempting to apply it to more significant conflicts or harms. This gradual approach builds the muscle of transforming anger into compassionate motivation, making it increasingly available during more challenging situations. What makes the bodhicitta approach particularly powerful is that it doesn't reject the energy of anger but redirects it. The intense energy that might manifest as rage when filtered through self-centeredness becomes powerful determination and clarity when channeled through bodhicitta. Many of the most effective agents of positive change throughout history have demonstrated this transformation, combining uncompromising clarity about what needs to change with genuine compassion for all involved, including those they oppose. This redirection connects back to Buddhist understandings of energy. Traditions like Tibetan Vajrayana recognize that emotions like anger contain tremendous power that, when transformed rather than suppressed, can fuel awakening. The archetypal figure of Vajrapani in Buddhism represents this transformed anger energy, powerful, direct, and sometimes fierce, but always motivated by compassion rather than hatred. This perspective offers hope that even those of us with strong anger tendencies can transform this energy rather than merely controlling or eliminating it. The cultivation of bodhicitta as a method for transforming anger connects naturally with another powerful Buddhist practice, the development of gratitude. While bodhicitta transforms the energy of anger into compassionate motivation, gratitude directly counteracts the negative mental habits that make us vulnerable to anger and bitterness in the first place. Buddhist approaches to gratitude go beyond simply appreciating good things in life, though this is certainly included. The deeper practice involves developing a fundamental gratitude for the entirety of our experience, including difficulties and challenges, recognizing how all of it provides opportunities for awakening and growth. This comprehensive gratitude creates a mind naturally resilient against the resentment and anger that arise from feeling that life has been unfair to us or that we've been deprived of what we deserve. The Buddha encouraged regular reflection on what he called the rare and precious human birth, the extraordinary good fortune of being born as a human with the capacity to hear and practice spiritual teachings. This basic gratitude for the opportunity to practice creates a positive background state of mind that's less prone to irritation and resentment. When we truly appreciate the gift of human life and the chance to develop wisdom and compassion, smaller annoyances naturally lose their power to provoke anger. Beyond this general appreciation, Buddhist practice includes specific gratitude reflections. One powerful traditional contemplation involves reflecting on the countless beings who have contributed to our existence and well-being. Before eating, for example, practitioners might contemplate all the people involved in growing, harvesting, transporting, and preparing the food, along with all the natural elements and processes that made it possible. This reflection reveals the vast web of interdependence that supports us constantly, counteracting the self-centered perspective that fuels much of our anger. Another traditional contemplation focuses on the benefits we've received from others throughout our lives. We reflect on how parents or caregivers provided for our basic needs when we couldn't care for ourselves, how teachers shared knowledge accumulated over generations, how countless people maintain the social and physical infrastructure we rely on daily. This reflection directly counters the sense of being unsupported or treated unfairly that often underlies chronic anger and resentment. Perhaps the most advanced gratitude practice in Buddhism involves developing appreciation for difficult people and challenging situations, recognizing them as valuable teachers that help us develop patience, compassion, and wisdom. As the Dalai Lama has said, "My enemies are my best teachers." This isn't about denying harm or pretending abuse is acceptable. but about recognizing that some of our most important growth comes through navigating difficulties rather than having an easy path. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience strongly supports the benefits of gratitude practice. Studies show that regular gratitude exercises significantly reduce negative emotions, including anger and resentment, while increasing positive emotions and overall life satisfaction. From a neurobiological perspective, gratitude practice helps counteract our brain's built-in negativity bias, the tendency to focus on and remember negative experiences more readily than positive ones. This negativity bias, which evolved to help our ancestors survive by staying vigilant for threats, creates a mind particularly vulnerable to anger and resentment. We naturally notice and dwell on perceived slights, unfairness, or mistreatment, while often overlooking or quickly forgetting the many kindnesses and benefits we receive daily. Gratitude practice deliberately counteracts this bias by training our attention to notice and appreciate the positive aspects of our experience that might otherwise go unrecognized. Practical approaches to developing gratitude include both formal and informal practices. Formally, many Buddhist practitioners maintain a daily gratitude reflection, perhaps at the beginning or end of the day, acknowledging specific things they're grateful for. This might include basic conditions like having food, shelter, and health, relationships that provide support and connection, opportunities to learn and grow, and even challenges that develop our inner strengths. Informally, gratitude can be integrated throughout daily activities. We might pause briefly before meals to appreciate the food and all that made it possible. When receiving help from others, we can take a moment to genuinely acknowledge their contribution rather than taking it for granted. When using public infrastructure like roads, clean water systems, or libraries, we can remember the countless people whose work makes these services possible. For those struggling with strong anger or resentment, starting a formal gratitude practice can create significant shifts relatively quickly. Research suggests that even simple interventions, like writing down 3 things you're grateful for each day for 2 weeks, can create measurable improvements in emotional well-being and reductions in negative emotions like anger. The key is consistency, making gratitude reflection a regular habit rather than an occasional practice. What makes gratitude particularly effective for transforming anger is that it works on multiple levels simultaneously. Psychologically, it shifts our attention from what's wrong to what's right, from what we lack to what we have. Physiologically, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing stress hormones that fuel angry reactions. Socially, expressed gratitude strengthens relationships, creating buffers against conflict and misunderstanding. These multi-level effects create comprehensive conditions for reduced anger and greater emotional well-being. Buddhist gratitude practice also addresses one of the root causes of chronic anger, the sense that we are owed something that we haven't received. Many of us carry an unconscious ledger of what we believe the world, other people, or life itself should have provided us. When reality doesn't match these expectations, resentment naturally arises. Gratitude practice gradually dissolves this sense of entitlement by helping us recognize how much we've already received and how many of our basic needs are continuously met through the efforts of countless others. This doesn't mean we should accept mistreatment or injustice with passive gratitude. As with other Buddhist approaches we've explored, gratitude practice is compatible with taking appropriate action to address problems and protect ourselves and others from harm. The difference is that action taken from a foundation of basic gratitude tends to be clearer, more effective, and less contaminated by the bitterness that often accompanies chronic anger. For example, you might need to address a pattern of disrespectful treatment from a colleague. Coming from a foundation of gratitude for the overall opportunity to work, for the skills you've developed, for the many positive aspects of your life beyond this specific challenge, you'll likely approach the conversation very differently than if you're coming from a place of accumulated resentment and bitterness. The former approach is more likely to result in positive change, while the latter often escalates conflict. Over time, consistent gratitude practice creates a mind increasingly resilient against anger and resentment. This doesn't mean never experiencing these emotions; they'll still arise in response to certain conditions. But a mind trained in gratitude doesn't provide the fertile soil where momentary anger can take root and grow into lasting bitterness. Instead, anger tends to arise, serve its function of alerting us to problems that may need addressing, and then naturally dissolve as we return to our baseline of appreciative awareness. This resilience represents the culmination of all the Buddhist methods for transforming anger that we've explored, from mindfulness that helps us recognize anger as it arises, to loving kindness that cultivates its opposite, from understanding impermanence to developing compassion for those who harm us, from recognizing the empty nature of our resentments to channeling anger's energy into compassionate action. All these practices work together to transform our relationship with this challenging but potentially enlightening emotion. Through patient, consistent practice, what once controlled us becomes instead an opportunity for deepening wisdom and compassion, not just for our own benefit, but for the welfare of all beings.